Before we begin tonight's story, I want to take just a moment to ask for your support. If you're enjoying this content, using your hype points on this video helps the channel more than you could possibly know. The algorithm notices engagement like that, and it makes a real difference in reaching new listeners. If you're tuning in on Spotify, leaving a review truly helps us out so much. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in. It connects us all in this strange community of night listeners. And of course, if you enjoy the content, subscribing means we can keep bringing you these stories week after week. Now let's get into tonight's encounter. There are certain jobs that exist in the margins of society, work that happens when most people are asleep, labour that keeps infrastructure running while the world dreams. I spent 3 years working night shifts for a company that calibrated industrial sensors across remote facilities, oil refineries, water treatment plants, agricultural monitoring stations scattered across hundreds of miles of empty land. The work was repetitive and technical. Each night followed the same rhythm. Arrive at the site, log into the system, run diagnostics, adjust sensitivity thresholds, document everything. The company was meticulous about procedure. Every reading logged with timestamps, every adjustment tracked in triplicate. Deadlines were strict, protocols were mandatory. Deviation from schedule could cost contracts worth millions. I preferred night work. Fewer people, fewer interruptions. Just me, the equipment, and the steady hum of machinery doing what it was designed to do. The facilities were usually automated. My job was to ensure the automation stayed accurate. Sensors drift over time, temperature fluctuations, humidity, electromagnetic interference from nearby equipment. Everything affects precision. Calibration corrects for that drift. It returns instruments to baseline accuracy. Nothing about that particular night suggested anything unusual. I had 17 sensors scheduled across 4 locations, standard maintenance window, 6 hours to complete the work. The weather was clear, equipment was functioning normally. I had done this exact route 40 times before. I clocked in at 2200 hours. The first 3 sites went exactly as expected. By midnight, I was ahead of schedule. The 4th location was a water monitoring station, 15 miles outside of town, middle of nowhere, surrounded by scrub brush and empty farmland. The nearest building was 4 miles away. I pulled up to the gate at 1:15 midnight. Everything looked normal. Chapter 1. The scheduled anomaly. The monitoring station was a small concrete building about the size of a garden shed. Most of the actual equipment was underground or mounted on exterior towers. My work happened at the control terminal inside. I unlocked the door, flipped on the lights, and logged into the system. 17 sensors total at this location. Soil moisture, groundwater levels, rainfall accumulation, chemical composition, temperature at various depths, standard agricultural monitoring. The kind of data that influences irrigation schedules and water rights across 3 counties. I started the calibration sequence at 12:23. The first 6 sensors responded perfectly. Green lights across the board. Readings within expected parameters. Adjustments minimal. I was documenting the 7th sensor when I noticed the anomaly. Sensor 12 was failing calibration, not in the usual way. Equipment failure presents as chaos, random noise, erratic spikes, silence. This was different. The sensor was returning precise, consistent readings, but they were wrong. Exactly 3.7 degrees off baseline. Every single time. No variation, no drift. Just that same offset, over and Over. I ran the sequence again. Same result. 3.7 degrees. I checked the physical connections. Solid. No corrosion. No loose cables. I rebooted the entire system. The anomaly persisted. Sensor 12. 3.7 degrees. Perfectly consistent. Perfectly wrong. The error was localized. The sensors on either side of it functioned flawlessly. Sensor 11 recorded normal readings. Sensor 13 was within tolerance. Only 12 was affected. The system flagged it as environmental interference. Not equipment malfunction, not software error. Environmental. That designation bothered me. Environmental interference implies something external is affecting the sensor. Something in the physical environment around the probe. But what could cause such a precise offset? I had seen electromagnetic interference before. It creates noise, static, random fluctuations. This was surgical, deliberate, as if something was intentionally skewing the reading by exactly that amount. I decided to inspect the physical site. Sensor 12 was located about 200 feet from the building. A simple probe driven into the ground, connected by buried cable. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out. Chapter 2. The light that isn't light. The night was perfectly still. No wind, no clouds, just stars and silence. My flashlight cut through the darkness as I walked the cable path towards Sensor 12. The ground was flat, dry grass and loose dirt. Nothing unusual. I was about halfway to the sensor location when I noticed the illumination. At first I thought it was moonlight, but the moon was only a thin crescent. Not bright enough to cast the kind of light I was seeing. This was different. Softer. It had no apparent source. I stopped walking and turned off my flashlight. The illumination remained. A faint glow that seemed to come from everywhere, and nowhere simultaneously. It did not cast shadows the way normal light does. Objects were visible, but they did not create darkness behind them. It was as if the light was bending around things rather than being blocked by them. I moved toward the sensor location. The illumination grew slightly stronger, still diffuse, still sourceless. I reached the probe and knelt down to inspect it. Everything appeared normal. The casing was intact, the ground around it undisturbed. But the light was undeniable now, visible even with my eyes closed, a gentle pressure against my eyelids. I stood and walked in a slow circle around the sensor. The light did not change intensity based on my position. It was not directional. I tried to determine where it was strongest. Every direction seemed equally illuminated. I moved closer to the probe. The light remained constant. I stepped back. Still the same. Then I walked directly at where the light seemed most concentrated. As I approached, it receded. Not quickly, not dramatically, but definitely moving away from direct engagement, like trying to grab fog. The closer I got to any specific point, the more the illumination shifted elsewhere. Always present, never quite touchable. I spent 20 minutes trying to document this with my phone camera. The footage showed nothing, just darkness and the beam of my flashlight. Whatever I was perceiving, the camera could not capture it. I returned to the building. The moment I crossed the threshold, the illumination vanished completely. Chapter 3. Time slips in small ways. I sat at the terminal trying to make sense of what I had experienced. My watch showed 1:15. That seemed wrong. I had left the building around 12:40. I had been outside for 20 minutes, maybe 25. It should have been 1:05 at the latest. I checked the system logs. They showed a gap in my activity from 12:41 to 1:17. 36 minutes, nearly 40. I had lost time, not hours, not days, just minutes. Enough to notice, enough to create discrepancy, not enough to trigger any alarms. I tried to reconstruct my actions, walking to the sensor, inspecting the probe, circling the area, attempting to film, even accounting for thorough investigation. I could not stretch those activities to fill 40 minutes, 15 minutes, maybe 20 if I was being extremely methodical. Not 40. I checked my watch against the system clock. They matched now. Both showed 1:18. I looked at my phone. Same time. Everything synchronized, except for that missing window between 12:41 and 1:17. I attempted to contact my supervisor via radio. No response. I tried twice more. Nothing. The radio was functioning. I could hear static when I keyed the microphone. But no one answered. I checked the schedule. My supervisor was supposed to be on duty, available for contact during all maintenance windows. Radio silence was unusual. I moved on to the remaining sensors. They calibrated normally. No anomalies, no interference, just standard readings and routine adjustments. I completed the work at 1:53. According to my original schedule, I should have been done by 1:30. I was behind, but not by much. I filed my report from the terminal. Sensor 12 listed as requiring follow-up. Environmental interference, cause unknown. Recommended secondary inspection during daylight hours. Everything documented according to protocol. Everything except the light and the missing time. Those details stayed out of the official record. I locked the building and returned to my truck. The drive back was normal. Empty roads, distant lights from farmhouses, radio playing quietly. Nothing unusual, but I kept checking my watch, kept comparing it to the dashboard clock, kept trying to account for those missing minutes. Chapter 4. The sound below. Hearing. The next few nights followed normal patterns, different sights, different sensors, no anomalies. I started to convince myself that the incident at the water monitoring station had been fatigue, misreading the clock, misjudging time in the dark. The illumination was probably some atmospheric phenomenon, temperature inversion, light refraction, something mundane with a scientific explanation. 5 days later, I was scheduled back at the same location. Routine check following my previous report. The company wanted confirmation that sensor 12 was stable. If the interference persisted, they would send a full technical team. If it had resolved, they would close the ticket and move on. I arrived at 22:30, earlier than my previous visit. I wanted extra time, wanted to approach this methodically. The gate was closed but unlocked. I drove up to the building and parked in the same spot as before. The night was warmer, humid. There were clouds on the horizon, but the sky overhead was clear. I unlocked the building and powered up the terminal. The system initialized normally. All sensors reporting. I went straight to sensor 12. I ran a diagnostic without calibration. Just a simple reading. Check. The sensor responded immediately. 3.7 degrees off baseline. Exactly the same offset as before. Perfectly consistent. I started the calibration sequence. The system attempted automatic correction. For a moment, the reading aligned. Perfect baseline. Green light, then it drifted. Back to 3.7. The system tried again. Same result. Brief correction. Immediate drift. After 5 attempts, the system gave up and flagged the sensor for manual intervention. I stood from the terminal and walked to the door. I did not open it yet. I just stood there, looking out through the small window at the darkness beyond. I took a breath and stepped outside. The illumination was already present, stronger than before, still sourceless, still bending around objects rather than casting shadows. I did not bother with my flashlight. I could see perfectly well in that strange light. That was when I felt the vibration. Not heard, felt. A deep rumble below the threshold of audible sound. It resonated in my chest, in my teeth, in the bones of my skull. Subsonic pressure, that made my lungs feel compressed, like standing too close to massive speakers at a concert, except there was no music, no rhythm, just constant, unrelenting pressure. I stopped walking and stood completely still. The vibration continued. I looked around. The grass was motionless, no wind, but I could feel movement in the air, something displacing space, creating waves of pressure that pushed against me from all directions simultaneously. I noticed the silence, complete silence. There should have been crickets, frogs, the distant barking of farm dogs. Rural areas are never truly quiet. There is always ambient sound, but not now. Every living thing within earshot had gone silent, as if the entire landscape was holding its breath. I took a step forward. The vibration intensified slightly. I took another step, stronger still. I was walking towards sensor 12, the same direction as before. The pressure built with each step, not painful, but commanding attention, impossible to ignore. I stopped about 50 feet from the sensor. The vibration was overwhelming now. My vision was starting to blur from the subsonic frequency. I could feel my heartbeat synchronizing with the pulse, my breathing matching its rhythm, my body trying to harmonize with something I could not see or hear. I turned around and walked back toward the building. The vibration decreased, step by step, the pressure easing. By the time I reached the door, it had stopped completely. The moment I crossed the threshold, normal sound returned. Crickets, frogs, a dog barking somewhere miles away, the world breathing again. I stood in the doorway for 5 minutes, just listening, just feeling. Everything was normal inside the building. Everything was wrong outside. Chapter 5. The second calibration. I returned to the terminal and pulled up the sensor logs. I wanted to see if the system had detected anything during my time outside. Temperature spike, seismic activity, anything that might explain what I had experienced. The logs showed nothing unusual, all environmental readings within normal range. No anomalies flagged except the persistent offset on sensor 12. I checked the timestamp. It was 23:51. I had been outside for approximately 30 minutes. Again, the same missing time, the same unexplained gap. I was certain I'd only been out there for 10 minutes, maybe 15, definitely not 30. I decided to try the calibration sequence one more time. I initiated the process remotely from the terminal. Sensor 12 began its cycle, reading, adjusting, confirming. I watched the numbers scroll across the screen. The offset persisted through the first 3 attempts. Then something changed. The system began adjusting itself before I input any commands. The calibration sequence was running autonomously, not according to the programmed pattern, according to something else, some external parameter I had not specified. The readings flickered. Baseline, offset, baseline, offset, oscillating between the 2 values faster than should have been possible. Then it stabilized. Perfect baseline. No offset, no drift. The sensor was reading exactly as it should. I documented the result, ran a confirmation diagnostic. Everything checked out. Sensor 12 was functioning normally. Whatever had been interfering was gone. I completed the calibration on the remaining sensors. All of them responded normally. No anomalies, no strange behavior, just routine maintenance. By the time I finished, it was 1:23. I had been at the site for nearly 3 hours. The work should have taken 90 minutes. I filed my report. Sensor 12 now operational. Interference resolved. Cause unknown. Recommended continued monitoring, but no immediate follow-up required. Standard closing language. Standard documentation. Everything according to protocol. I packed my equipment and headed for the door. I paused with my hand on the knob. part of me wanted to go back outside to see if the illumination was still there, to feel if the vibration had returned. But another part of me knew that was a terrible idea. I had completed my work. The sensor was functioning. There was no technical justification for additional investigation. I opened the door and walked quickly to my truck. I did not look around, did not slow down, just moved directly from the building to the vehicle. I started the engine and drove away. I checked the rearview mirror once. The station was dark, normal, nothing unusual visible, but I could still feel the vibration in my chest. Hours later, miles away, that subsonic pressure still resonating in my bones. Chapter 6. The shape that refuses focus. I did not return to that site for 2 weeks. The company rotated me to different facilities, different routes. I welcomed the change. I needed distance from that monitoring station, time to process, time to convince myself that everything had a rational explanation. During those 2 weeks, I researched atmospheric phenomena, subsonic resonance, optical illusions caused by temperature gradients. I read scientific papers, watched educational videos, tried to match my experience to documented natural occurrences. Nothing fit perfectly, but several phenomena came close enough to provide comfort. I decided I had witnessed an unusual combination of environmental factors, rare but explicable, concerning but not impossible. The call came on a Thursday. My supervisor needed me to return to the water monitoring station. Sensor 12 was showing anomalies again. Same offset, same pattern. The company wanted me to do a physical inspection, check for animal damage, root intrusion, anything that might be causing interference. If I could not identify the problem, they would schedule a full excavation and sensor replacement. I arrived at the site at 2100 hours, earlier than usual. I wanted to complete the inspection before full darkness. I still had daylight fading into dusk, enough visibility to work without relying entirely on artificial light. I parked and grabbed my inspection kit, tools, testing equipment, camera, documentation tablet, everything needed for thorough site assessment. I walked directly to sensor 12. The illumination was not present yet. Everything looked normal in the failing daylight. I knelt beside the sensor and began the inspection. I checked the casing for cracks, examined the cable connection for corrosion, dug carefully around the probe to verify installation depth. Everything was perfect. Textbook installation. No physical damage, no environmental stress, no reason for the sensor to malfunction. I was photographing the installation when I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. Not direct movement, more like a disruption in the air. The way heat creates shimmer above hot pavement. Except the evening was cool. There was no heat source. I turned my head to look directly at the disturbance. It vanished, completely gone. I returned to photographing the sensor. The movement reappeared, peripheral, persistent, always at the edge of my vision. I stood slowly and stopped looking directly at anything. I let my focus soften, stopped trying to see clearly. The shape became more defined, not solid, but structured. It had dimensions, boundaries, form, something that occupied space, something that refused to be seen directly. Looking at it was disorienting. My eyes wanted to focus, wanted to sharpen the image, but every attempt to do so made the shape dissolve. Only peripheral vision could maintain the perception. Only indirect observation kept it visible. The harder I tried to see it clearly, the more completely it disappeared. I experimented carefully. I turned my head slowly. The shape remained visible as long as I did not look directly at it. I took a step forward. It neither approached nor retreated. It simply was, present, observing, waiting. I reached out my hand, not toward the shape, just extending my arm into the space where I peripherally perceived it to be. My hand passed through nothing, empty air, but I could feel resistance, not physical, something else, like pushing through a magnetic field, pressure without substance. I withdrew my hand and stepped back. The shape remained constant, not threatening, not aggressive, just there, existing in that narrow band of perception between seen and unseen, present and absent, real and impossible. The sun dropped below the horizon, full darkness arrived, the sourceless illumination appeared. The shape became easier to perceive, still peripheral, still refusing direct observation, but more defined, more persistent, as if darkness provided better conditions for its visibility than light. Chapter 7: Communication without words. I stood there for what felt like hours, watching without looking, perceiving without seeing. My understanding of the situation began to shift. This was not random, not accidental, not environmental interference. This was intentional, deliberate. Something was present, something was aware, something was communicating. The certainty arrived without language, without voice, without any sensory input I could identify. Just sudden, absolute knowledge. Not fear, not curiosity, not wonder, just understanding. The way you know someone is watching you before you see them. The way you sense mood in a room before anyone speaks. Direct perception, bypassing conscious thought. I was being assessed, evaluated, studied. Not with hostility, not with threat, with something closer to clinical interest. I was a subject of observation, a data point, a specimen displaying unexpected behaviour by returning repeatedly to this location. The communication was not bidirectional. I could not send, only receive. Ideas arrived fully formed. Not as words or images, as comprehension, instant, complete. Understanding of complex concepts. No translation required, no interpretation needed. Direct transfer of meaning. I understood that this presence had been here long before me, would remain long after. That sensor 12 was not malfunctioning. It was detecting something real, something that registered on instruments designed to measure environmental conditions. The offset was accurate. The environment had changed, just not in ways the equipment was designed to recognize. I understood that my previous visits had been noted, that my return had been anticipated, that my willingness to experience rather than flee had marked me as different from other maintenance workers who had been here before. Most people ran. Most people convinced themselves they had seen nothing. Most people never came back. I understood that what I was experiencing was permitted, not forced, not inflicted, allowed. I could leave at any time. The presence would not follow, would not pursue, would not cross boundaries. It had set for itself. My participation was voluntary. My continued observation was a choice. The certainty was overwhelming. Not through intensity, through clarity. There was no room for doubt, no space for alternative interpretation, just pure, undiluted knowing. The same way you know your own name, the same way you know which direction is up. Foundational reality that requires no proof because it exists prior to questioning. I stood there receiving this wordless communication until it stopped. The flow of understanding simply ended, like a faucet turning off. The connection severed cleanly. I was alone again in my own thoughts, my own uncertainty, my own desperate need to make sense of impossible experience. The illumination remained. The shape remained visible in peripheral view. But the communication had concluded. Whatever assessment was being conducted had reached a natural pause. I was dismissed, not rudely, not abruptly, simply released from observation. I walked back to the building. I did not run, did not rush, just walked at normal pace. The presence did not follow, did not react. I crossed the threshold, and the illumination vanished as before. I was back in the normal world of electric lights and humming machinery. Chapter 8. The Rule That Cannot Be Broken. I spent the next hour documenting everything I could. Not in the official report, in a personal file on my phone. Details, observations, attempts to capture the experience in language. The writing was inadequate. Words could not convey the directness of that communication. But I tried anyway. I needed some record, some proof to myself that this had happened. I checked the sensor logs. Sensor 12 still showed the offset, still perfectly consistent. 3.7 degrees, I ran calibration. The sensor adjusted normally. The offset disappeared. 5 minutes later, it returned. The pattern continued. Function, drift, correction, drift. As if something was persistently influencing the readings despite all attempts at calibration. I shut down the terminal and went back outside. I needed to test something. I walked to the property line. The monitoring station sat on leased land, a rectangle of approximately 2 acres surrounded by fence. The fence was old, minimal, just marking boundaries, not designed for security. 3 strands of wire on metal posts. I stopped at the fence line. The illumination extended to this boundary, stopped precisely at the property edge, did not cross onto the neighbouring land. I walked along the fence. The light maintained that exact border, as if the property line was a physical barrier rather than a legal abstraction. I circled the entire perimeter, same pattern everywhere. The illumination respected the boundary completely, perfectly, without deviation. Whatever was present understood property lines, understood human designations of space, chose to honour them. I returned to the building and tested another hypothesis. I propped the door open, stood just outside the threshold. The illumination was present, the shape visible peripherally. I stepped inside. Everything vanished. I stepped out. Everything returned. I repeated this several times. The transition was instant, absolute. The building interior was completely protected, separate, isolated. Something about enclosed spaces created a barrier this presence would not cross. It remained outside, in open air, in spaces defined by boundaries. It acknowledged, but did not touch. It followed rules, invisible rules, rules I did not understand, but could observe in their effects. I walked to my truck. The presence did not approach the vehicle, did not come near. I opened the door, sat in the driver's seat with my feet still on the ground. The illumination persisted. I pulled my feet inside and closed the door. It vanished. The truck was an enclosed space, protected, forbidden. These rules were absolute, right? Not suggestions, not preferences. Boundaries the presence could not or would not cross. I was safe in the building, safe in my vehicle, safe anywhere enclosed. Vulnerable only in open space, only on designated property, only when I chose to be. This realization was both comforting and disturbing. Comforting because it meant I had control. I could always retreat, always escape. Disturbing because it implied intention, purpose, intelligence capable of understanding and respecting human concepts like property and shelter. This was not natural phenomenon. This was something that thought, something that chose, something that operated according to logic I could observe but not comprehend. Chapter 9. The report that goes nowhere. I completed my inspection the following morning, returned at 0600 after sleeping in my truck. Daylight inspection showed nothing unusual. I photographed everything, documented thoroughly, filed a comprehensive report, sensor 12 installation intact, no physical damage, no environmental stress, interference cause unknown, recommended continued monitoring. The response came 3 days later. Email from regional management, polite, professional, dismissive. They had reviewed my report, consulted with technical specialists, determined the interference was most likely atmospheric distortion. Temperature inversion creating localized effects, not uncommon in agricultural areas, not cause for concern. They appreciated my thorough documentation. The email continued. Due to budget constraints and facility optimization, the calibration window for this site was being reduced. Future maintenance would occur quarterly instead of monthly. Sensor 12 would be monitored remotely. If anomalies persisted, they would schedule automated replacement during the next major upgrade cycle. No further manual intervention required. I read between the lines. They were removing this site from regular rotation, minimizing contact, avoiding the problem rather than solving it. Someone had made a decision, easier to ignore than investigate, cheaper to work around than confront. I checked the maintenance schedule. I was removed from this location entirely, reassigned to facilities closer to town, sites with more predictable conditions, more conventional challenges. They were protecting me, or protecting themselves. Hard to say which. I wanted to argue, wanted to insist this required serious investigation. But what could I say? That I had seen unexplainable light, felt subsonic vibration, experienced wordless communication with invisible presence, that sensors detected something real but unmeasurable. I would sound unstable, unreliable, possibly dangerous to employ in isolated locations. I accepted the reassignment without comment, confirmed the schedule change, thanked management for their consideration, professional courtesy maintained, career protected, truth buried. Chapter 10. Others have seen it too. I tried to forget about it, tried to focus on normal work, normal sites, normal sensors that malfunctioned for normal reasons, but the memory persisted. The certainty of that communication, the absolute knowing that I had experienced something real, something significant, something that refused to be dismissed as imagination or atmospheric distortion. 3 months later, I was having coffee with another technician, Marcus. He worked the same circuit I did. Different shift, different schedule. We crossed paths occasionally, talked shop, compared notes about problematic sites and difficult equipment. We were discussing a particularly frustrating sensor array when he mentioned the water monitoring station. Said he had been there once, hated it, never wanted to go back. Something about the place felt wrong, made him uncomfortable. He had rushed through the calibration and left early. Filed a report recommending the site be reassigned. I asked carefully what he meant by wrong. He struggled to explain. Said the light looked weird, that time felt slippery, that he kept feeling, watched. He laughed when he said it, embarrassed, admitting to irrational discomfort. I told him I had felt the same thing. His relief was visible. Validation that he was not crazy, not alone. Over the next few weeks, I had similar conversations, different technicians, same basic story, always during maintenance windows, always during transitions between day and night, always dismissed, always reassigned. The company knew, had to know. Too many reports, too many requests for site removal, too many people experiencing the same unexplainable discomfort. The pattern was impossible to ignore. This was not isolated incident, not personal psychological episode, not equipment malfunction. This was consistent, repeatable, documented. Something was at that location. Multiple people had encountered it. Everyone who stayed long enough, everyone who paid attention, everyone who did not immediately flee. I started collecting stories, not officially, just listening, remembering, noting similarities, the light without source, the subsonic pressure, the sense of being observed, the missing time, the rules about boundaries and enclosures. Every account matched, details varied, core experience remained identical. One technician mentioned seeing shapes in peripheral vision. Another described feeling certainty without explanation. A third talked about sensors detecting environmental changes that made no physical sense. Everyone described the same phenomenon using different words. Everyone had been dismissed. Everyone had stopped talking about it. We formed an informal network. People who had been there, people who knew. We did not discuss it openly, did not create records, just quiet acknowledgements when we crossed paths. A knowing look, a brief conversation, validation that we were not alone in what we had experienced. The company continued to minimize contact with that site. Calibration windows became less frequent. Remote monitoring increased, automated systems replaced. Manual inspection. The location was being phased out, not closed, not investigated, just slowly, quietly removed from active rotation. Epilogue. Why it only appears during calibration. It took me another year to understand why. Why calibration specifically? Why that particular window of activity? Why sensors detected what humans could barely perceive? The answer was obvious once I stopped trying to explain it away. Calibration strips filters. That is its entire purpose. Remove assumptions, eliminate drift, return instruments to baseline accuracy, align systems to objective reality rather than accumulated error. Calibration corrects for everything we unconsciously add to perception, everything we assume is true, everything we ignore because it does not fit our expectations. Human perception is filtered, constantly, automatically. Our brains discard vast amounts of sensory input, keep only what seems relevant, what matches patterns, what conforms to our model of reality. We see what we expect to see, miss what does not fit. That filtering is survival, necessary, protective, but it obscures. Calibration removes those filters, temporarily, incompletely, but enough. Enough to detect what is always there, what exists in the baseline state, what our assumptions normally hide. The sensors were not malfunctioning. They were accurate, detecting real environmental conditions, conditions that human perception automatically filters out. Whatever I encountered at that monitoring station exists continuously, not appearing, not arriving, not manifesting, just present, always, perceivable only when our filtering systems are disrupted, when we align ourselves to baseline reality instead of processed assumption, when we calibrate our awareness to what is actually there rather than what we expect to be there. The presence follows rules because it exists in a framework of reality we normally cannot perceive. Property lines are not legal abstractions, they are something else, something real in dimensions we do not access. Enclosed spaces are not just physical barriers, they are boundaries in a geometry we do not comprehend. The rules are not arbitrary, they are consistent with a logic we can observe but not understand. Some encounters do not arrive, they are uncovered, revealed through the temporary suspension of the filters we use to navigate consensus reality. Calibration creates those moments, those windows where baseline truth becomes briefly accessible, where we perceive what instruments detect, where we experience what is always present but usually invisible. I still work night shifts, still calibrate sensors, still follow protocols and document readings. But I understand now that some anomalies are not errors. Some environmental interference is environment. Some detections are accurate measurements of reality we choose not to acknowledge. The water monitoring station is still there, still operational, still showing occasional anomalies on sensor. 12, 3.7 degrees, always, consistently, real. I have not been back. The company made sure of that. But I think about it. Wonder if the present still observes, still assesses, still waits for the next person who stays long enough to see, who pays enough attention to perceive, who chooses understanding over fear. Because that is the final truth I took from that experience. The presence was never hostile, never threatening, never aggressive. It was simply there, existing, aware, curious about the rare humans who could temporarily perceive it, who could calibrate themselves to baseline reality long enough for contact. Some nights, when I am calibrating sensors in other locations, I feel that familiar pressure, that subsonic vibration, that sourceless illumination at the edge of perception. And I know, whatever I encountered is not unique to that water monitoring station. It exists in many places, possibly everywhere, hidden by our filters, revealed through calibration, present in the baseline reality we spend our lives ignoring. The job is still repetitive, still technical, still full of logs and timestamps and procedures. But now I understand it differently. Every calibration is a window. Every adjustment to baseline is an opportunity, not to find something new, to uncover what was always there. Some encounters do not arrive. They are uncovered. And once you know that, once you truly understand it, you can never see reality the same way again. There exists a window of time that almost no one observes, not because it's hidden, but because observation requires consciousness, and consciousness requires witnesses. Between 3 and 5 in the morning, cities don't sleep so much as they idle. Traffic lights cycle through their patterns for empty intersections. Security cameras record hallways no one walks. Computer systems run diagnostics that no one monitors in real time. This is when I saw it. Or rather, this is when I noticed something that suggested I had been seeing it all along. My name is Marcus Webb, and for the past 11 years I've worked as a systems coordinator for the Regional Water Treatment Authority. It's not glamorous work. Most people don't think about where their water comes from or how it's managed until something goes catastrophically wrong. My job is to make sure nothing goes catastrophically wrong. I monitor flow rates, chemical balances, pressure differentials across a network of pumping stations, and treatment facilities that serve about 200,000 people. I work the overnight shift, midnight to 8 in the morning, 4 days a week. The pay differential makes it worth the circadian disruption, and honestly, I prefer it. No meetings, no supervisors hovering, just me, 6 monitors, and the quiet hum of systems doing exactly what they're designed to do. The event I'm about to describe didn't announce itself. There were no lights in the sky, no mysterious figures, no equipment failures or power surges. What happened was far more subtle, and in retrospect, far more unsettling. It started with a number that was technically correct, but contextually impossible. Chapter 1. The Anomaly on a familiar screen. It was a Tuesday morning in late September. The timestamp read 3:17. I had been monitoring a routine chlorination cycle at Treatment Plant 7, one of our smaller facilities located about 15 miles outside the city proper. The process is automated, but we maintain human oversight because water treatment operates on the principle that redundancy saves lives. The chlorine injection rate was reading 0.72 parts per million, well within acceptable parameters. The flow rate through the contact chamber showed 2.4 million gallons per day. Normal for that time of night. The residual chlorine reading at the discharge point measured 0.68 parts per million. I had been staring at these numbers for maybe 20 seconds before I realised what was wrong. The contact time didn't match. In water treatment, contact time is the duration that water spends in contact with chlorine before it's considered disinfected. It's a function of volume and flow rate. Given the size of Plant 7's contact chamber and the flow rate being reported, the contact time should have been roughly 90 minutes. The system was reporting 93 minutes. 3 minutes isn't much. It wouldn't trigger any alarms. The system builds in tolerances for exactly these kinds of minor variations. Equipment drifts, calibrations shift. Real-world physics rarely aligns perfectly with theoretical calculations. But I had been doing this job for 11 years. I knew Plant 7 systems intimately. A 3-minute drift didn't happen gradually. It happened when something in the flow dynamics changed. I checked the influent delta, no variation. I checked the chamber level sensors, stable. I pulled up the historical logs and scrolled back through the past 6 hours. The drift had appeared suddenly at 2:41 in the morning, 36 minutes ago. The contact time had been 90 minutes at 2:40. At 2:41, it jumped to 93 minutes, and it had stayed there. I ran a diagnostic on the flow meters. They came back clean. I checked for air pockets in the contact chamber that might create dead zones. Nothing. I reviewed the chemical feed logs to see if someone had adjusted injection rates, without logging it properly. All normal. The numbers made sense individually. They just didn't make sense together. I logged the discrepancy as a minor anomaly and flagged it for the day shift to investigate. Probably a sensor issue. Probably nothing. Then I noticed something else. The moment I flagged the issue and looked away from that screen to check another facility, the contact time corrected itself. When I looked back, it read 90 minutes again. Exactly 90 minutes. I stared at the screen for a full minute. The reading held stable. 90.0 minutes. Not 90.1. Not 89.9. Exactly 90. I unflagged my report and deleted the notation. I told myself I had misread it the first time. Fatigue. Too much coffee. Not enough sleep before the shift. But I didn't believe that. I have a near photographic memory for numbers. It's why I'm good at this job. I opened a blank document and typed Plant 7 contact time anomaly 2:41 to 3:17. 93 minutes reported, then corrected to 90 on observation. I saved it to my personal drive, not the system logs. I didn't know why. It just felt like the right thing to do. The rest of the shift passed without incident. I didn't mention it to the day crew during shift change. What would I even say? I saw a number that changed when I stopped looking at it. They'd think I was losing it. I drove home as the sun came up, went to bed, and slept poorly. Chapter 2. Corroboration without communication. 3 nights later, I was back on shift. Different day of the week, same time window. I had almost convinced myself the contact time thing had been exactly what I'd told myself it was. Misread data, tired eyes, coincidental timing. Then the temperature readings started drifting. Plant 7 again. This time, it was the raw water intake temperature. Our sensors monitor the temperature of incoming water because it affects chemical, dosing rates, and biological activity. The intake pulls from a reservoir that maintains fairly stable temperatures, especially at depth. At 2:39 in the morning, the intake temperature read 54.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Standard for that time of year. At 2:43 it read 54.7. At 2:47 it was at 55.1. A 9/10 degree rise in 8 minutes. That doesn't happen. Water temperature changes slowly. Even if there were a thermal layer mixing event in the reservoir, we'd see gradual fluctuation, not a steady linear increase. I checked the outflow temperature from the treatment process. It had risen proportionally. I checked the ambient air temperature at the facility. It had actually dropped slightly. I checked weather data for the area. Clear skies, no wind, no atmospheric anomalies. The temperature continued to climb. 55.3, 55.6, 55.8. I was reaching for the phone to call the facility maintenance line when the increase stopped. The reading held at 56.0 degrees. Then over the next 12 minutes, it dropped back to 54.2, exactly where it had started. The rise had been 0.1 degrees per minute. The decline was 0.15 degrees per minute, almost like something was testing the system's response time, or measuring its thermal characteristics. I documented it. Personal file again. Same instinct as before. Then I did something I probably shouldn't have. I called Raymond Torres. Raymond works the same shift I do, but he monitors electrical grid distribution for the Regional Power Authority. Different agency, different systems, but we occasionally overlap on infrastructure coordination. We'd grabbed coffee a few times. He was solid, rational, not prone to jumping to conclusions. I didn't tell him what I'd seen. I just asked him a hypothetical. Ray, if you saw system behavior that was technically within parameters, but contextually weird, would you report it? There was a long pause. Then, what kind of weird? The kind where nothing is actually wrong, but the numbers don't tell the story they should. Another pause. You seeing something? Maybe. You? He was quiet for maybe 15 seconds. Then, yeah, Tuesday night. Voltage phase imbalances on a distribution substation. Not enough to trigger alerts, but enough to notice. Came and went over about 40 minutes. I checked everything. Equipment's fine. Load patterns were normal. It just happened. What time, I asked. Started around 2:30, resolved by 3:20. My stomach tightened. Which substation? Station 44. Serves the industrial corridor and the East County area. Plant 7 was in the East County area. Did you report it? I asked. I logged it. Got a response saying they'd review it. Haven't heard anything since. When did you log it? Wednesday morning. You? Same. We were both quiet. Then Raymond said, Marcus, what's going on? I don't know, but I think something is paying attention to infrastructure. Paying attention how? That's what I'm trying to figure out. We agreed to keep each other informed if we saw anything else. The conversation ended there. Neither of us wanted to say what we were both thinking. The rest of my shift was quiet. I kept watching Plant 7's data streams, but everything behaved normally. At some point around 5 in the morning, I realised I was hoping for another anomaly. Just to confirm, I wasn't imagining patterns where none existed. Nothing happened. I went home feeling more unsettled than I had after the first incident. Chapter 3. The object that isn't an object. The third occurrence was different. This time I saw something, or rather, I saw the absence of something. It was early October, about 2 weeks after my conversation with Raymond. I had started arriving at work 30 minutes early and staying 30 minutes late, expanding my observation window. I told myself it was due diligence. Really, I was looking for it, whatever it was. At 2:53 in the morning, I stepped outside for air. The operations centre where I work sits on the edge of an industrial park, surrounded by warehouses and light manufacturing facilities. At night, the area is essentially deserted. A few security lights, the occasional truck passing on the frontage road. Nothing else. The sky was clear, new moon, the kind of darkness you don't get in cities. I was looking up, not for any particular reason, just appreciating the stars, when I noticed something odd about the light patterns. There's a cell tower about a quarter mile to the northeast. Red aircraft warning lights blink at the top. I've seen those lights thousands of times. I could time my coffee breaks by their rhythm, but that night the blinks were wrong. Not in timing. They still flashed at the regulation interval. But twice, maybe 3 times, the light appeared to blink behind something. Not a cloud. The sky was clear, not a bird. The interruption was too geometric, too consistent. Something was between me and that tower. Something that didn't reflect light. Something that had depth and dimension, but no visible surface. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes watching. The interruption happened again. The red light blinked, and for just a fraction of a second, it was occluded. Not dimmed, not scattered, blocked. I went back inside and pulled up our site's external security camera feed. We have 4 cameras with overlapping fields of view, covering the parking area and building perimeter. I rewound to the time I'd been standing outside. The footage showed me clearly, standing there, looking up, but it showed nothing else. No object, no shadow, no anomaly in the frame. I switched to the infrared mode we use for overnight monitoring. Still nothing. But when I looked at the timestamp, metadata, something caught my attention. The camera had logged 3 brief buffering events during the time I was outside, each lasting less than a second. Not enough to disrupt recording, but enough to appear in the diagnostic log. I checked the network traffic analysis. During those buffering moments, data transmission from that camera had spiked, not by much, just enough to suggest the processor was working harder than usual to encode the video stream, as if it was trying to render something it couldn't quite process. I filed that in my personal documentation as well. Growing larger now. Screenshots, log exports, timestamps. I was building a case file without knowing what the case was. Chapter 4. The pattern. Over the next month, I documented 17 separate incidents. Not all at Plant 7. Not all involving the same type of system anomaly. but all sharing certain characteristics. They occurred between 2:30 and 3:45 in the morning. They lasted between 20 and 55 minutes. They involved measurements that were technically accurate, but contextually improbable. They resolved themselves without intervention. They left no permanent evidence in official logs. I created a spreadsheet. Date, time, duration, system affected, type of anomaly, correlation factors. I'm not a data scientist, but I know enough about pattern recognition to see what was emerging. Whatever this was, it operated on a schedule, not a regular schedule. The incidents didn't happen every night or even every week, but when they did happen, they clustered around specific times. Tuesday and Thursday nights were most common. Weekend incidents were rare, but not unheard of. I cross-referenced this against shift schedules, maintenance logs, and operational patterns. Tuesday and Thursday nights were when we ran reduced staffing. Fewer people monitoring systems, more automation, longer gaps between human observation. It was choosing when to appear, based on when it was least likely to be noticed. But it wasn't trying to hide. If it wanted to avoid detection completely, it could have. Our systems aren't monitored with perfect vigilance. There are gaps, blind spots, times when no one is watching at all. Instead, it was operating in a margin, present enough to be detectable if someone was paying attention, quiet enough to be dismissed as instrumental error if they weren't. That suggested something I didn't want to consider. It wanted to be found, but only by someone who was looking carefully. Raymond had continued reporting his observations. Voltage anomalies, frequency drift, momentary load imbalances, always in the same time window, always resolving without cause. He told me his reports were being acknowledged, but never investigated. The responses were polite and professional. "Thank you for your diligence. We'll monitor the situation." And then nothing. I asked him if he thought we were being ignored. "No," he said. "I think we're being managed." That was somehow worse than being ignored. Chapter 5. The Missed Report. In mid-November, I decided to file an official report, not through my normal supervisory chain, but through the infrastructure anomaly reporting system maintained by the State Utilities Commission. It's designed for exactly this kind of thing, unexplained system behaviour that doesn't rise to the level of emergency but warrants documentation. I spent 3 hours writing it. I included timestamps, system logs, correlation analysis, and cross-references to Raymond's electrical grid observations. I didn't speculate about causes. I just presented data. Factual, professional, verifiable. I submitted it on a Monday morning before I went to bed. By Wednesday night, when I came back on shift, I had a response. The email was cordial. It thanked me for my thoroughness. It acknowledged that I had identified some interesting correlations. It noted that periodic anomalies in automated systems are common and generally attributable to sensor drift, environmental factors, or timing coincidences in how multiple systems sample data. The report had been reviewed by appropriate technical staff. No safety issues were identified. No pattern of equipment failure was evident. The anomalies I documented fell within expected operational variance. The case was closed. No follow-up questions. No request for additional data. No interest in the correlation with electrical grid observations. Just noted, reviewed, closed. I read that email 4 times. Then I called Raymond. "Did you file a formal report?" I asked. "Last week." "You?" "Yeah, got a response today." "Let me guess. Thank you for your diligence, case closed?" "Pretty much." "Same here." He paused. "Marcus, I've been thinking about this. Maybe we're making something out of nothing. These systems are complex. Coincidences happen." "You don't believe that?" "No," he admitted. "But I don't know what I do believe. And I'm starting to think maybe that's intentional. What do you mean? I mean, whoever reviewed our reports knew exactly what we were seeing, and they closed the cases anyway. Not because they think we're wrong, but because they think we're right and they don't want it investigated. I didn't sleep well that day. Chapter 6. The Near Encounter. December brought early snow. Not much, just enough to make the roads inconvenient and give me an excuse to leave for work even earlier than I'd been doing. I told myself it was about avoiding traffic. Really, I was still looking. On a Thursday night, 3 days before Christmas, I got closer than I ever wanted to. We'd had a minor equipment issue at Plant 7. A backup generator had failed its automated test cycle, which meant someone needed to physically inspect it to determine if it was a genuine fault or a sensor error. Normally, we'd wait for day shift maintenance, but the forecast called for heavy snow overnight, and protocol required backup power systems to be verified operational before severe weather. I volunteered to drive out there. It's only 15 miles. I had the access codes. I'd done field inspections before. I left the operations centre at 2:23 in the morning. The drive was uneventful. Roads were clear. No other vehicles. The snow hadn't started yet, but I could smell it in the air. That particular metallic crispness that comes before a storm. I reached Plant 7 at 2:41. The facility was quiet. Security lights illuminated the main treatment buildings. Everything looked normal. I parked near the generator building, grabbed my inspection tablet and flashlight, and headed inside. The generator checked out fine. The sensor had failed, not the equipment. I documented it, reset the test cycle, and confirmed it passed. Total time inside, maybe 12 minutes. When I came back outside, something was wrong. Not obviously wrong, not dramatically. Wrong. Just wrong. The air felt thick, not humid, not cold, just resistant. Like moving through something slightly denser than air should be. The sound was off too. I could hear the hum of the facility equipment, but it seemed muted, distant. Like I was hearing it through a wall. I looked up. The sky was overcast now, clouds having moved in while I was inside. But the light was strange. The security lights created halos that extended farther than they should. The shadows were too sharp. Then I noticed my truck. It was exactly where I'd parked it, but it looked farther away. Not much, maybe 10 or 15 feet, except I knew I'd parked it 30 feet from the generator building entrance. I always park in the same spot. I walked toward it. Each step felt normal, but when I reached the truck, I turned back toward the building. The distance looked right now. 30 feet, like it should be. My depth perception wasn't working correctly. I got in the truck and started the engine. The dashboard clock read 2:58. I had been inside for 12 minutes. It was now 34 minutes since I'd left the operations centre. That left 10 minutes unaccounted for. 10 minutes of drive time on a 15-mile route that should take 18 minutes. I sat there trying to make sense of it. Had I driven faster than I realised? Had I lost time inside the building? Was the clock wrong? Then I looked at my phone. It agreed with the truck's clock. 2:58. I checked my inspection tablet. The timestamp on my generator report showed I'd entered the building at 2:43 and completed the inspection at 2:55. That was 12 minutes, but I'd arrived at 2:41. 2 minutes were missing between when I parked and when I entered the building. I tried to remember those 2 minutes. I remembered parking. I remembered getting my equipment. I remembered walking to the door. But there was a gap, a smoothness in the memory, like a transition seen in a movie where time passes, but nothing happens. I drove back to the operations centre. The route took exactly 18 minutes. Nothing unusual happened. By the time I pulled into the parking lot, I'd almost convinced myself I'd just lost track of time. Simple explanation, human error. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been somewhere else for those 2 minutes. Somewhere that wasn't quite aligned with normal space. Chapter 7. After Effects. No missing time after that. No injuries, no dramatic physical evidence. But things were different. Small things, subtle things. My sense of timing became imprecise. I've always been able to estimate elapsed time accurately. It's a useful skill for my job. But after that night at Plant 7, my internal clock was consistently off. I'd think 5 minutes had passed and it would be 7. I'd estimate 15 minutes and it would be 12. I started having trouble with spatial relationships, not dramatically. I could still drive, still function normally, but occasionally a doorway would seem narrower than I remembered, or a hallway would feel longer. The distortions were brief, momentary, but persistent. I also developed an acute awareness of being watched. Not by people, not by cameras, just watched. The feeling would come on suddenly, usually during the quiet hours at work. I'd be monitoring systems, and the back of my neck would prickle. I'd turn around, nothing there, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I mentioned this to Raymond during one of our coffee meetings. He looked uncomfortable. "Yeah," he said, "I've been feeling that too, like something's paying attention." "Since when?" "About a month, since I filed that report." We didn't talk about it much after that. What could we say? We were both rational people who worked with empirical systems. We dealt in measurements and verifiable data. Feelings of being watched didn't fit into that framework, but the feeling persisted. I also started noticing patterns in my peripheral vision, quick movements that resolved into nothing when I looked directly, shadows that didn't align with light sources, brief distortions in reflective surfaces. None of it was dramatic enough to document. None of it was clear enough to verify. It existed in that margin between perception and imagination. The most disturbing change was the dreams. I don't normally remember my dreams, but starting in January, I began having the same dream repeatedly. I was standing in the parking lot at Plant 7 looking up. The sky was full of stars, but they were wrong, moving in patterns that stars don't move, and I was aware that something enormous was overhead. Not threatening, just present, observing. In the dream, I always felt calm, curious, like I was being shown something important that I couldn't quite understand. I'd wake up with no anxiety, no fear, just a profound sense of having missed something obvious. Chapter 8. Independent Confirmation. In late February, I found the forum. I wasn't looking for it. I was researching infrastructure monitoring protocols for work and stumbled across a discussion thread on an engineering message board. The topic was about unexplained sensor anomalies in automated systems. Most of the posts were routine troubleshooting, but one thread caught my attention. Someone with the username GridWatch had posted a detailed description of voltage anomalies they'd observed over several months. The pattern was identical to what Raymond had documented. I created an account and messaged them privately. I didn't give details, just asked if they'd noticed any temporal patterns. They responded within an hour. Tuesday and Thursday nights, 2:30 to 4, you too? We ended up talking for 3 hours. GridWatch was a power systems engineer in Oregon, 600 miles from where I was. Different grid, different utility authority, but the same pattern, same time window, same unexplained resolution. Over the next week, I found 4 more people: a wastewater treatment operator in Nevada, a telecom systems analyst in Colorado, a meteorologist in Idaho who'd noticed atmospheric measurement anomalies, an air traffic controller in Montana who tracked brief radar artifacts. All of them had seen something. All of them had reported it through official channels. All of them had been told essentially the same thing. Interesting observations, no safety concern, case closed. None of them knew each other. None of them had connected their observations to anything larger. Until now. We created a private group. We started sharing data, and the pattern became undeniable. Across 5 states, over 18 months, at least 27 people had documented the same phenomenon. System anomalies that were technically valid, but contextually impossible. Always during low observation hours, always resolving without intervention, always occurring in proximity to critical infrastructure. The most chilling discovery was the geographic pattern. When we plotted the incidents on a map, they formed a rough grid, not random, not clustered in one area, distributed across the western United States in a way that suggested methodical coverage. Something was surveying infrastructure, systematically, comprehensively, and it had been doing so for at least a year and a half, probably longer. We just hadn't noticed until we compared notes. Chapter 9. The theory that explains too much. In March, I developed a working hypothesis. I didn't share it with the group immediately. I wanted to test it against the data first. The hypothesis went like this. What we were observing wasn't visiting Earth, it wasn't arriving or departing. It was already here, had been here, would continue to be here. It existed in the margins of human observation, not hiding, not avoiding detection, simply operating in the spaces between our attention. It interacted with systems, not people. It measured, it tested, it observed, but it didn't interfere beyond what was necessary to gather data. The contact was non-invasive, almost respectful. It triggered anomalies only when they wouldn't cause harm. It resolved them before human operators needed to act. It avoided patterns that would force official acknowledgement. This suggested several disturbing possibilities. First, it understood human systems well enough to know how they were monitored. Second, it had access to operational schedules and staffing patterns. Third, it could predict when anomalies would be dismissed versus investigated. Fourth, it had been doing this long enough to refine its approach. The most unsettling implication was this. The phenomenon wasn't studying our infrastructure to understand our technology. It was studying our infrastructure to understand us, how we organize, how we coordinate, how we respond to anomalies, how we filter information, how we decide what to investigate and what to ignore. It was learning the patterns of human collective behavior by watching how we managed our shared resources. When I finally shared this hypothesis with the group, the response was mixed. Some thought I was overinterpreting. Some thought I wasn't going far enough. But no one could offer a better explanation that fit all the data. The air traffic controller, whose username was Skywatch, raised a question that stuck with me. If it's been here all along, and it's this good at staying in the margins, how many of them are there? And what happens when they're done studying? No one had an answer. Chapter 10. Why it never became a story. You'd think something like this would make headlines. 27 witnesses, documented evidence, multiple jurisdictions, a pattern spanning multiple states. But it didn't. Here's why. No single incident was dramatic. Each anomaly, taken individually, was easily explained. Sensor drift, calibration error, environmental factors, human fatigue. No evidence survived rigorous scrutiny. We had logs and timestamps and correlation analyses, but we didn't have physical proof. No photographs, no video, no material samples. Nothing that couldn't be dismissed as instrumental artifact. No authority denied it strongly enough to raise questions. Our reports were acknowledged, they were reviewed, they were filed. The response was professional, thorough, and completely non-committal. There was nothing to push against, no cover-up to expose, just polite bureaucratic processing. The story died because it was too quiet to fear. It didn't fit the narrative of how contact should happen. No invasion, no communication, no revelation. Just data that didn't quite add up in ways that most people would never notice. I tried talking to a journalist once, met them at a coffee shop, showed them the spreadsheet, the timeline, the geographic distribution. They were interested for about 10 minutes. Then they asked the question that killed it. What do you want people to do with this information? I didn't have an answer because there was nothing to do, no threat to prepare for, no action to take, no demand to make. It was just information about something that was happening, and that wasn't enough. The journalist thanked me for my time and never followed up. Our private group continued documenting incidents. We compared notes, we refined our data, but we stopped trying to convince anyone else. What was the point? We'd learned what we needed to learn. We were being studied, carefully, patiently, by something that had no interest in being known. And the world continued exactly as it had before. Epilogue. Still there. It's late April now. I'm writing this during my shift. 3:32 in the morning. The quiet hours. Plant 7 is running normally. All systems within parameters. Nothing unusual in the logs. But I'm watching, and I know it's there. Not tonight maybe, but soon, Tuesday or Thursday, between 2:30 and 4, something will drift. Some measurement will be technically correct, but contextually impossible. And I'll document it, add it to the file, send it to the group, and nothing will change. The phenomenon is still operating, still measuring, still learning. The incidents haven't stopped. They've just become part of the background, part of what infrastructure does in the hours when no one is watching. I don't know what it wants. I don't know what it's building toward. Maybe nothing. Maybe it's purely observational. Maybe we're as interesting to it as soil bacteria are to us. Present, measurable, ultimately not concerning. Or maybe it's waiting, gathering enough data to understand us completely. Learning our patterns so thoroughly that when it does make itself known, we won't even realize it's happening. The water still flows, the power still runs, the systems still hum along exactly as they're designed to, and somewhere in the margins, in the spaces between human attention, something watches. It's not hiding, it's just patient, and I suspect it's been here much longer than we think. The quiet hours are when the world runs on automation, when cities idle instead of sleep, when critical systems operate without human oversight. It's the perfect time for observation. And I think it knows we know it's there. It just doesn't care if we believe it. Because belief isn't required for observation to continue. The numbers tell their story. The patterns persist. The evidence accumulates in private files and abandoned reports. And in the quiet hours, when the world stops watching, we are being watched in return. I don't know how this ends. I don't know if it ends. I just know that whatever is out there operates on timescales we can't imagine. And what seems like an 18-month study to us might be the briefest glance to them. A moment of curiosity, a passing interest, a casual survey of infrastructure managed by creatures who still measure time in years instead of eons. We build systems to last decades. It thinks in millennia, and will never be able to prove it was here, because it leaves no evidence that can't be explained away, no proof that survives the filter of official skepticism, no story dramatic enough to overcome the human preference for comfort over truth. So it remains what it has always been, an anomaly, a curiosity, a pattern that technically shouldn't exist but can always be dismissed. And in the quiet hours I watch my screens, and I know I'm not the only one watching. The question isn't whether it's real. The question is what happens when it finishes collecting data, and whether we'll even notice when it does. My shift ends in 4 hours. The sun will rise, the day crew will arrive, systems will continue their routines. And tonight, during the hours nobody watches, it will be back. Measuring, testing, observing. Still there, always. There, in the quiet hours, where nobody looks. Imagine a world before flight, before radar, before radio waves crossed the oceans, a world where the sky belonged only to birds and clouds and the occasional hot air balloon, tethered to the earth by rope and hope. The year was 1897. The Wright brothers were still running a bicycle shop. Powered flight was a fantasy confined to the sketches of dreamers and the pages of Jules Verne novels. And yet, something was flying. Not drifting, flying, with purpose, with control, against the wind. This is not legend. This is not folklore passed down through generations until truth became myth. This is documented history. Tens of thousands of Americans reported seeing massive objects in the sky during the spring of 1897. Newspapers across the Midwest and beyond printed eyewitness accounts. Telegraph operators relayed messages from town to town, each one describing the same impossible thing. They called it the mystery airship. What follows is the account of one man who didn't just see it, he spoke to it. Or rather, it spoke to him. His name was Thomas Kellerman, and in April of 1897, he was a telegraph operator in a small city that no longer appears on most maps. He wrote this account in 1932, 3 years before his death, and it was discovered in a trunk in his daughter's attic in 1978. This is his story. Chapter 1. The night the wires went silent. I had been working the late shift at the Western Union office on Meridian Street for nearly 6 years when it happened. April 14th, 1897. A Tuesday. The kind of night where the air feels heavy even though no rain is coming. The kind of night where dogs pace and horses stamp in their stables for no reason anyone can name. The office was quiet. It usually was after 9 in the evening. Most messages had been sent. Most businesses had closed. I sat at my desk with the telegraph key in front of me. the familiar brass instrument that connected our small city to the rest of the civilized world. In those days, before telephones were common, before radio existed even as a concept, the telegraph was everything. It was how news travelled, how money moved, how the world spoke to itself. I was transcribing a message from Chicago when every line went dead at once, not flickering, not fading, dead. The silence was absolute. In 6 years of operating that key, I had never experienced anything like it. Telegraph lines fail, certainly. Storms knock them down. Animals chew through insulation. Poles fall. But it happens gradually, one line at a time, one city losing connection while others remain. This was different. Every single line to every city we connected with went silent in the same instant. I checked the connections, I tested the battery, I tapped the key repeatedly, sending out calls that went nowhere. Nothing. The lines were physically intact as far as I could tell from inside the office, but they carried nothing. No hum, no static, just dead air. I noted the time, 9:42 in the evening. I sat there in the lamplight, waiting, because there was nothing else to do. The office felt strange in the silence. Normally there was always some background noise, the faint clicking of distant keys, the subtle vibration of signals passing through the wires even when they weren't intended for us. But now there was nothing. It felt like the entire country had stopped breathing. The silence lasted exactly 9 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall, counting every second, wondering if something catastrophic had happened, if somehow the entire telegraph network had been destroyed in some unimaginable disaster. And then at 9:51, every line came back online simultaneously. The key began clicking immediately. Message after message flooded in, all marked urgent, all from different cities within a 100-mile radius. I pulled the tape as it printed, reading the words as they appeared. From Fort Wayne, large object in sky moving south, glowing, silent, not a balloon. From Lafayette, airship sighted over courthouse, impossible size, controlled movement. From Muncie, strange craft overhead, lights along hull, moving against wind, no sound. From Anderson, cigar-shaped vessel in sky, multiple witnesses, telegraph interference reported. They kept coming, every town, every operator, all reporting the same thing within the same 9-minute window when our lines had been dead. Something was in the sky, something large, something that moved with intention, and something that had interfered with every telegraph line in the region at exactly the same time. I stood up from my desk, my hands shaking slightly as I held the printed tape. The messages were still coming in, variations on the same theme. I walked to the front window of the office and looked out onto Meridian Street. A few people were outside, standing in small groups, pointing upward. I opened the door and stepped into the cool night air. That's when I saw it. Chapter 2. The Shape. No one could explain it, hung in the sky about 1,000 feet up, maybe less. Distance is hard to judge when you have no reference for the object's size, but it was large, enormously large. Perhaps 200 feet long, shaped like a cigar or a massive elongated egg. The surface appeared dark, almost black, but along the underside ran a series of small lights, maybe 20 or 30 of them, evenly spaced, glowing with a soft yellow-white colour. It moved slowly from north to south, directly over the centre of town. I need you to understand what I'm describing. This was 1897. There were no airplanes. The Zeppelin would not be invented for another 3 years. Balloons existed, certainly, but they were at the mercy of wind, round and clumsy, and incapable of the controlled movement I was witnessing. This object moved deliberately. When the wind blew, From the east, the object continued south. When the wind shifted northwest, the object maintained its course. It was not drifting, it was flying, and it was silent. No engine noise, no propeller sound, nothing. Just the faint whisper of wind around its hull, like the sound of a ship cutting through water. But softer, almost gentle. Several people on the street stood frozen, their faces tilted upward, mouths slightly open. I recognised the bank manager, the owner of the general store, a school teacher whose name I forget. Normal people having an abnormal experience. Someone said, "What in God's name is that?" No one answered because no one had an answer. I watched as the object passed directly overhead. The lights on its underside pulsed very slightly, not rhythmically, like a heartbeat, but irregularly, as if responding to some internal process I couldn't understand. The hull itself seemed smooth, almost seamless, without the rivets or panels you would expect on any human-made construction. It looked poured rather than built, organic in a way that metal should not be. A young boy, maybe 12 years old, stood near me on the sidewalk. He asked his father, "Is it from the government?" His father, a blacksmith with hands like hammers, shook his head slowly. "Government doesn't have anything like that, son. Nobody does." The object was moving toward the southern edge of town now, descending slightly as it went. I could see it more clearly as it lowered. There were features I hadn't noticed before, what looked like small protrusions along the sides, perhaps observation ports or windows, though they emitted no light. A subtle taper at the front, like the bow of a ship designed to cut through air instead of water, and at the rear, a series of thin structures that might have been fins or stabilizers. It passed over the last row of buildings and continued toward the open farmland beyond. As it moved, I realized it was heading directly toward the railroad yard, a flat open area where freight cars sat waiting for morning. I made a decision in that moment that would change everything. I went back inside the office, grabbed my coat and hat, and locked the door behind me. Then I followed the airship. Chapter 3. The City Watches. By the time I reached the edge of town, at least 50 people had gathered. Word spreads fast in a small city, especially when something impossible appears in the sky. The crowd stood at the boundary, between the last street and the open land, watching as the airship descended slowly toward the rail yard about half a mile distant. The local newspaper editor, a man named Robert Marsh, was there with a notebook, scribbling frantically by the light of a handheld lantern. He looked at me as I approached. "Kellerman," he said, "your telegraph's still working." "It's working now," I replied. "Went dead for 9 minutes right before this thing appeared. Every line in the region reported the same." He wrote that down, his pencil moving rapidly across the page. "Multiple towns reporting sightings. I already confirmed at least 8 within 50 miles, all describing the same object. This is going to be front page across the country." A woman in the crowd, elderly and sharp-eyed, said loudly, "It's a sign, end times. The Bible speaks of vessels descending from heaven." A younger man countered, "It's Edison, or Tesla, has to be. Some kind of electric airship they've been testing in secret." Someone else, "Could be European. Germans have been working on dirigibles." But we all knew those explanations didn't fit. This thing moved too smoothly, too quietly, with too much control. And the timing, the simultaneous telegraph interference, the coordinated sightings across multiple cities, none of it aligned with any human technology we knew. The airship had stopped descending and now hovered about 30 feet above the rail yard. The lights along its underside grew slightly brighter, casting pale circles of illumination on the ground below. The crowd grew quieter, sensing something was about to happen. I felt it too, a pressure in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Then the lights on the airship began to pulse in a pattern. Not random, deliberate, a sequence. Long pulses and short pulses with precise intervals between them. I recognized the rhythm immediately. It was Morse code, or something very close to it. I pulled a small notebook from my pocket, the one I always carried for recording messages, and began writing down the sequence. Long, short, short. Long, long, short. Short, long, long. It repeated 3 times, then stopped. I stared at the pattern, trying to decode it, but it didn't match any standard Morse sequences I knew. The intervals were wrong. The groupings were unfamiliar. Robert Marsh leaned over my shoulder. "What does it say?" "I don't know," I admitted. "It's structured like code, but it's not any code I recognize." The airship began moving again, drifting slowly eastward, away from the town and the crowd. Some people started to follow, walking across the open field, but most remained where they were, uncertain and afraid. I stood there with my notebook, watching the lights fade into the distance, and felt a strange certainty settle over me. This wasn't observation. This was communication, and it was directed at me. Chapter 4. The Interference. I returned to the telegraph office just after midnight. The streets were still busy with people discussing what they had seen. Groups gathered under street lamps, voices excited and nervous. I unlocked the door and went inside, lighting the lamp on my desk. The office felt different now, charged somehow, as if the air itself had been altered by what had happened. The telegraph key sat silent on the desk. I sat down in my chair and stared at it, thinking about the pattern of lights I had seen on the airship, the way they pulsed in structured sequences. I opened my notebook and looked at what I had written. Long, short, short. Long, long, short. Short, long, long. Then the key began clicking on its own. My hand was nowhere near it. The key depressed and released, tapping out a rhythm that made the brass lever bounce and the sounder clack. I watched, frozen, as the tape began feeding through the register, recording whatever signal was coming through the wire. But there was no signal. I could see that the line indicator showed no activity. The battery was disconnected. The key should not have been moving at all. It clicked for perhaps 30 seconds, printing a line of marks on the tape that made no sense in Morse code. Then it stopped. The office fell silent again. I pulled the tape free and held it up to the lamplight, studying the pattern. It was similar to what I had seen on the airship, but more complex, more detailed. There were subtle variations in the spacing, slight differences in the length of the marks that suggested layers of meaning I couldn't access. I set the tape down on the desk and looked out the window. The airship was no longer visible in the sky, but I had the unmistakable feeling that it was still close, still watching. The pressure in my head returned. That same sensation I had felt when the lights had pulsed in the rail yard. Not painful, but present, like someone standing just behind you in an empty room. I reached out and placed my fingers on the telegraph key. I began tapping out a simple message in standard Morse code. "Who are you?" The moment I finished, the key stopped vibrating under my hand. The pressure in my head intensified briefly, then vanished. I sat there in the silence, waiting for a response, but nothing came. I tried again. "What do you want?" Still nothing. Then I realized my mistake. I was using human language, human symbols. Whatever was on the other end of this communication understood structure and pattern, but not necessarily our specific codes. I needed to respond in the same way it had contacted me. I looked at the sequence on the tape, the pattern it had sent. I began tapping it back on the key, reproducing the rhythm as accurately as I could. Long, short, short. Long, long, short. Short, long, long. I repeated it 3 times exactly as the airship's lights had done. The key went still under my fingers. And outside, barely visible through the window, the airship descended from the clouds directly above Meridian Street. It hung there, motionless, the lights on its underside glowing bright enough now to cast shadows on the street below. I stood up slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, and walked to the door. I opened it and stepped outside. The airship lowered until it hovered just above the roof line of the buildings. I could see details now that had been invisible from a distance. The hull was not metal, or if it was metal, it was unlike any I had ever seen. It had a faint iridescence, like oil on water, shifting subtly in colour as the light moved across it. The small protrusions I had noticed earlier were definitely ports of some kind, circular openings rimmed with a darker material. And then, with no sound at all, the airship began to move again. It drifted southward, slowly, deliberately, and I understood that it wanted me to follow. I grabbed my coat and hat from inside the office, locked the door, and began walking. Several people on the street watched me go, watched the airship drifting ahead of me, but no one else followed. Perhaps they were too afraid, perhaps they were smarter than I was. I followed the airship out of town, toward the rail yard, toward whatever waited there. Chapter 5. The Descent. The rail yard was deserted at that hour. Freight cars sat in silent rows, their shadows long under the moonlight. The airship descended slowly into the centre of the open area, its lights illuminating the dirt and gravel below. I approached carefully, staying about 100 feet back, watching as the massive object lowered itself to the ground with impossible gentleness. It touched down without impact, settling onto the earth as lightly as a feather. The lights along the underside dimmed slightly, but did not go out. I could hear it now, a very faint humming, so low it was almost below the threshold of hearing. Not mechanical, more like a vibration, a frequency felt as much as heard. 2 other men had followed me from town, though I hadn't noticed them until now. One was Robert Marsh, the newspaper editor, still clutching his notebook. The other was a farmer named William Hayes, a practical man not given to flights of fancy. We stood together at the edge of the rail yard, 3 witnesses to something none of us could explain. The airship sat there for perhaps 5 minutes, humming softly, its lights pulsing in that strange irregular rhythm. Then, with a sound like air escaping from a sealed container, a section of the hull opened. Not a door swinging on hinges. The surface simply separated, creating an opening about 6 feet tall and 3 feet wide. No light came from inside, only darkness, and then a figure stepped out. Chapter 6. The Occupant. It was humanoid. That was the first thing I noticed. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, a torso, proportioned similarly to a human being, but not quite right. Too tall, perhaps 7 feet. Too thin, the limbs longer than they should be. It wore some kind of tight-fitting garment that covered everything except the head and hands. A material that looked almost liquid in the moonlight, dark blue or black, seamless. The head was the most unsettling feature, pale, hairless, with large eyes that caught the light and reflected it back with a faint golden sheen. The nose was small, almost vestigial. The mouth was a thin line, barely visible. The overall impression was not monstrous exactly, but profoundly other. This was not a human being in a costume. This was something else. It stood at the opening of the airship, motionless, and turned its head slowly to look at each of us in turn. When its eyes met mine, I felt that pressure in my head again, stronger now, almost overwhelming. Not painful, but intrusive, as if something was pushing gently against the inside of my skull. I tried to step back but found I couldn't move. My feet seemed rooted to the ground. The figure stepped forward, moving with a strange gliding motion that made it hard to tell if it was walking or floating. It approached us slowly, stopping about 20 feet away. Robert Marsh made a small choking sound and dropped his notebook. William Hayes stood rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. I remained still, unable to move, locked in place by whatever force was emanating from this being. And then it spoke. Or rather, it communicated. There was no sound, no words, but meaning flooded into my mind with absolute clarity. Not language, concepts, images, understanding delivered directly, bypassing the need for translation. I saw maps, not maps of land, but maps of connection. Lines crisscrossing continents, nodes where the lines intersected, pulses of light moving along the paths. I saw cities connected by invisible threads, messages flowing between them at the speed of lightning. I saw the telegraph network, not as wires and poles and keys, but as humanity's first attempt at creating a nervous system, a way for the species to communicate across distance instantly. And I understood that this was what interested them. Not our cities, not our wars, not our religions or governments or art, our communication networks. The moment when we stopped being isolated communities and started becoming something connected, something that could speak to itself across vast distances. The pressure in my head increased and more images came. I saw the airship, not as a single vessel, but as one of many, positioned across the continent, observing, recording. I saw them hovering over telegraph stations, following the lines, mapping the network. They were studying the infrastructure of human communication, the way a naturalist might study the veins in a leaf. And then I saw something else, a flash of the future, though I didn't understand it at the time. I saw towers transmitting invisible waves through the air. I saw voices carried without wires. I saw light pulsing in patterns that conveyed thought and image and sound simultaneously. I saw the world covered in a web of signals so dense that no point on Earth was isolated. Everything connected, everything speaking. They were interested in the beginning of that process, the moment we became detectable. The figure tilted its head slightly, and I felt a question forming in my mind. Not words, but the sense of inquiry. It wanted to know if I understood. I tried to form a response, to think clearly and deliberately. Yes, I understand. The pressure released immediately. The figure stepped back, its large eyes still fixed on me, and then turned smoothly and walked back to the airship. It paused at the opening, looked back once more, and then disappeared inside. The hull sealed itself with that same soft hissing sound. I could move again. I staggered slightly, catching my balance, and looked at Robert and William. They both appeared shaken, pale in the moonlight. Robert picked up his notebook with trembling hands. "Did you?" he started, then stopped. "Did you see?" "Yes," I said quietly. "I saw." The airship began to rise. Chapter 7. The Message. It lifted slowly, without sound, without fire or steam, or any visible means of propulsion. The lights along the underside grew brighter as it ascended, casting long shadows across the rail yard. We watched it climb until it was several hundred feet up, then turned smoothly and begin moving northward, back toward the centre of town. I ran, I don't know why. Instinct, perhaps, the sense that something important was about to happen, and I needed to be at the telegraph office when it did. Robert and William followed, the three of us running through the dark streets as the airship drifted overhead. By the time we reached Meridian Street, people were emerging from their homes again, pointing at the sky, calling to each other. I unlocked the office and rushed inside, Robert and William close behind. I lit the lamp and sat down at the telegraph desk just as the key began clicking again. this time it was different. This time, it was deliberate, controlled, sending a specific pattern. The tape fed through the register, recording the marks as they appeared. The sequence was complex, far more intricate than anything I had seen before. It went on for nearly 2 minutes, the key clicking steadily, the tape spooling out onto the desk, and then it stopped. The airship, visible through the window, rose straight up at tremendous speed and vanished into the clouds in seconds. The lights faded. The humming ceased. It was gone. I pulled the tape free and spread it out on the desk. Robert leaned over my shoulder, his breath still coming in short gasps from the run. William stood by the window, watching the empty sky. I studied the pattern, trying to make sense of it, but it was beyond my understanding. The sequences were too complex, the variations too subtle. It looked almost mathematical, like some kind of formula or equation rendered in dots and dashes. "What does it mean?" Robert asked. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I think it's important." I folded the tape carefully and put it in my pocket. The three of us sat there in silence for a long time, processing what we had witnessed. Eventually, Robert spoke. "I have to write this story. People need to know." "They won't believe you," William said quietly. "They'll say you're mad." "Maybe," Robert replied, "but I still have to try." He left shortly after, and William followed. I remained in the office, sitting at the desk, thinking about the maps I'd seen, the networks of light, the future, that had been shown to me. I thought about the being that had communicated with me, the way it had looked at me with those large golden eyes, and I wondered what it had seen when it looked back. The telegraph lines remained quiet for the rest of the night. No more strange signals, no more interference, just the normal flow of messages between cities, the routine communication that kept the country connected. But I knew that nothing was routine anymore. Something had noticed us. Something had come to observe the moment when humanity learned to speak across distance, and they had left me a message I couldn't understand. Not yet. Chapter 8. The Departure. The next morning, the story spread like wildfire. Robert Marsh published his account in the newspaper, describing the airship in detail, naming me and William as witnesses. Other papers picked up the story. Within days, it was being reported across the country. Thousands of people came forward with their own sightings, describing similar objects in skies from Texas to Michigan, from California to New York. But the narrative began to change almost immediately. Editors started adding qualifying language. Alleged airship, reported sighting, mass hysteria. Scientists weighed in, offering explanations. Venus seen through atmospheric distortion, ball lightning, experimental balloons from secret government projects. The explanations multiplied, each one more confident than the last, each one ignoring the specific details that made the sightings impossible to dismiss. Robert Marsh came under significant pressure. His editor at the paper demanded he retract the story, calling it irresponsible journalism. Local officials questioned him, suggesting he had fabricated the account for attention. Within 2 weeks, a follow-up article appeared in the paper, written by Robert but clearly edited heavily, stating that upon further reflection, he believed the object had been a misidentified balloon, and that the late hour and unusual circumstances had led to mistaken observations. He came to see me at the telegraph office the night that article was published. He looked exhausted, defeated. "I'm sorry," he said. "They didn't give me a choice. It was retract or lose my position." "I understand," I told him. "Did I do the right thing?" he asked. "Should I have fought harder?" I thought about the being I had seen, the message I had received, the future I had glimpsed. "You did what you had to do to survive," I said. "That's all any of us can do." He nodded slowly and left. I never spoke to him about it again. William Hayes stopped coming into town, retreating to his farm, refusing to discuss what he had seen. I was questioned by government officials, men in dark suits who arrived from Washington and asked the same questions over and over, their faces impassive, their voices flat. They wanted to know what I had seen, what had been communicated, whether I had the telegraph tape. I told them everything except that last part. I described the airship, the being, the images in my mind. But I said nothing about the final message, the pattern that had been sent to my telegraph key. That tape remained in my pocket and later hidden in a metal box in my home. The officials eventually left, seemingly satisfied that I had nothing useful to offer. The sightings continued for another month, then gradually stopped. By summer, the airship wave had faded from public consciousness, dismissed as a curious episode of mass delusion. Life returned to normal. The telegraph lines carried their routine messages. The country moved forward, unaware that it had been observed at a crucial moment in its development. But I knew, and I kept the tape, waiting for the day when I might understand what it meant. Chapter 9. The Aftermath. Years passed, the 20th century arrived. The Wright brothers achieved powered flight in 1903, and suddenly the skies that had been impossible for humans to navigate became accessible. Airplanes multiplied. The impossible became commonplace, but the airship of 1897 was forgotten, relegated to the dustbin of historical oddities, a footnote in the story of American credulity. I continued working as a telegraph operator until 1918, when I retired. I married, had children, lived a quiet life, but I never forgot that night in April of 1897. I kept the tape hidden, taking it out occasionally to study it, hoping that new developments in communication technology might give me a framework for understanding the pattern. In 1920, when commercial radio broadcasts began, I felt a shock of recognition. The frequencies, the way signals were transmitted through the air, without wires, the patterns of electromagnetic waves, they echoed something I had seen in the images the being had shown me. The future I had glimpsed was beginning to arrive. I took out the tape and studied it again, this time with knowledge of radio technology, and slowly, over the course of months, a pattern began to emerge. The sequences on the tape corresponded to frequency intervals. Not exact matches, but close enough that the correlation couldn't be accidental. The message was a map of the electromagnetic spectrum, highlighting specific ranges that would become useful for human communication. They had given me a guide to radio frequencies before we had discovered radio. I sat at my kitchen table, the tape spread out in front of me, and understood fully for the first time what had happened. The airship had not been exploring our world. It had been monitoring our technological development, waiting for the moment when we created infrastructure for long-distance communication. The telegraph network had been the trigger, the sign that humanity was transitioning from isolated communities to a connected civilization. And they had come to observe that transition, to record it, perhaps to encourage it by leaving behind information we would eventually be able to understand. They were tracking the moment we became detectable across interstellar distances, the moment our signals began radiating out into space. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. We had been noticed, we had been deemed worthy of observation, perhaps even assistance, but we had also revealed ourselves, broadcasting our presence to anyone or anything capable of detecting electromagnetic radiation. We had become visible. Chapter 10. Understanding Too Late. I am writing this account in 1932. I am 78 years old. My hands shake when I hold a pen, and my eyesight is failing. But I feel compelled to record what I experienced, what I understood, even if no one believes it. The world has changed dramatically since 1897. Radio is everywhere. Telephones connect continents. Television is beginning to emerge. The network of communication that I glimpsed in those images, shown to me by the being from the airship, has become reality. We are connected now in ways that would have seemed magical to someone from my youth, and we are broadcasting constantly. Radio waves carrying music and news and voices radiate out from our planet in every direction, travelling at the speed of light, reaching farther into space with every passing year. We have become a beacon, announcing our presence to any civilization capable of detecting it. I look at the tape sometimes, the message sent to me that night in the rail yard. I understand it now, mostly. It was a primer, a basic guide to the frequencies we would need for effective communication. It was meant to help us, or perhaps to accelerate our development. I don't know if the being expected me to share this information, or if it simply assumed that we would discover these things on our own, and the message was merely confirmation. I never shared it. Perhaps that was a mistake. Perhaps I should have given the tape to scientists, let them study it, let them use the information to advance our technology faster. But I was afraid of being labelled insane, afraid of the attention it would bring, afraid of what it might mean if the information was taken seriously. So I kept silent, and the world developed radio on its own, following the natural progression of scientific discovery. Maybe that was how it was supposed to happen. Maybe my role was simply to witness, to understand, to record. I have thought often about the being I met, the way it looked at me with those large golden eyes. I have wondered what it saw when it examined me. Did it see an intelligent creature, worthy of contact? Or did it see a primitive organism, barely beginning to understand the universe it inhabited? Did our brief communication mean anything to it, or was I simply a data point, one among thousands, recorded and filed away? I have also thought about why they came when they did. The telegraph was not the first human technology. We had been building and creating for thousands of years, but the telegraph was different. It was the first technology that allowed instant communication across vast distances, the first that created a network, a web of connection that covered the continent. It was the moment when we stopped being isolated and started being unified. That was what interested them. Not our tools or our weapons or our buildings. Our ability to communicate. Our transition from scattered tribes to a connected civilization. They were observing a threshold being crossed, a moment of transformation. And now, as I write this in 1932, I wonder if they are still watching. Radio has existed for over a decade. Our signals are spreading through space, reaching farther every day. Have they detected those signals? Are they observing our continued development? Will they return? I don't know, but I suspect they don't need to return. They came at the crucial moment, the beginning. They recorded what they needed to record, and now they are waiting, watching from a distance as we continue to evolve, as we continue to build our networks, as we continue to broadcast our presence to the universe. We think we are alone. We think the vast silence of space confirms our isolation. But I know differently. I have seen proof that we are observed. I have met a being from beyond our world, communicated with it, received information from it. We are not alone. We have never been alone. We just didn't know how to see until we learned how to speak across distance. Epilogue. The quiet warning. I will die soon. I can feel it in my bones, in the increasing fragility of my body. My daughter will inherit my belongings, including the metal box with the telegraph tape inside. I have left instructions that it should be preserved, though I doubt she will understand why. Perhaps someday, someone will find it and recognize its significance. Perhaps not. But I want to leave this final thought, this last observation that has haunted me for 35 years. The airship did not arrive when we learned to fly. It did not arrive when we built cities or created art or developed philosophy. It did not arrive when we discovered fire or invented the wheel or domesticated animals. It arrived when we learned to speak across distance, when we created networks that connected us invisibly, instantaneously, when our signals began to propagate beyond our immediate surroundings. That was the threshold. That was the moment that mattered. And if that is the case, if the ability to communicate across distance is what marks a civilization as significant, as detectable, as worthy of observation, then what happens when our communication networks expand beyond our planet? What happens when our signals reach the stars? What happens when we are not just connected to each other, but potentially connected to others? I think about this often as I sit in my chair, looking out the window at the night sky. Somewhere up there, beyond the stars I can see, are others, civilizations that learned to speak across distance long before we did, civilizations that have been broadcasting their presence for centuries or millennia, civilizations that are connected in ways we cannot yet imagine. And they are listening. They arrived when we learned to speak across distance. They observed us at that crucial moment. They left a message for us to find when we were ready. The question is not whether they will return. The question is what they heard when they listened, and whether we are ready for what comes next. This is the account of Thomas Kellerman, telegraph operator, written in the autumn of 1932. The metal box containing the telegraph tape was discovered in 1978 among his daughter's possessions. The tape remains in a private collection. Its authenticity has never been verified, and the pattern recorded on it has never been fully decoded. But radio continues to broadcast, and somewhere, perhaps, someone is still listening. End. Before we begin tonight's story, I want to take just a moment to ask for your support. If you're enjoying this content, using your hype points on this video helps the channel more than you possibly know. It genuinely makes a difference in reaching new listeners. If you're tuning in on Spotify, leaving a review also helps out tremendously. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting me know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. Finally, if you enjoy this kind of content, subscribing really does help us continue making these stories for you. Now let's begin. There are encounters that arrive in blazing light, descending from the heavens with undeniable force. Ships hovering over cities, beings stepping from crafts into clearings, moments that shatter reality and demand acknowledgement. This is not that kind of story. This is about the signal that came quietly. The one that understood silence. The one that knew exactly when to appear and, more importantly, when to hide. This is about the night shift nobody talks about. The data nobody was supposed to notice. And the growing certainty that observation itself might be the only form of contact we were ever meant to have. Because not all encounters arrive in the sky, some arrive through data. Chapter 1. A routine. Anomaly. The surveillance data processing facility outside Tonopah, Nevada, was designed with a singular purpose: to be unremarkable. The building itself looked like a standard industrial warehouse from the highway, complete with faded paint and a gravel parking lot that suggested decades of benign neglect. The only hint of its actual function was the fence, a 12-foot chain-link barrier topped with 3 strands of barbed wire and cameras positioned at precise intervals. Inside, the work was equally designed to fade into background noise. My name is Marcus Webb, and for 3 years, I worked the overnight data monitoring shift. Midnight to 8 in the morning, 5 nights a week. The job description made it sound technical and important. Real-time analysis of atmospheric monitoring data for anomalous patterns. In reality, it meant watching screens full of waveforms and numerical readouts, while the automated systems did the actual work. The facility processed data from various monitoring stations scattered across the southwest. Seismic sensors, atmospheric sampling equipment, radiation detectors, and electromagnetic monitoring arrays. Most of it fed into national databases that tracked everything from weapons testing to geological activity. My job was to babysit the pipeline and flag anything the automated filters might miss. They designed the work to be boring. Most nights, nothing happened. The first anomaly appeared on a Tuesday in late September. The timestamp read 0247 when I noticed the irregularity in the electromagnetic monitoring feed from Station Delta 7, a remote installation about 40 miles northwest of the facility. It was subtle, a spike in the lower radio frequencies, slightly outside the expected range, but well within normal variance. The kind of thing that could be atmospheric interference, a passing aircraft, or a hiccup in the equipment itself. The automated system logged it, but didn't flag it. No alarms, no alerts. I watched the waveform for about 90 seconds. The spike held steady, then dropped back to baseline, as smoothly as it had appeared. Total duration, approximately 3 minutes. I made a note in my shift log. 0247, Delta 7 EM spike. Probable atmospheric interference. Then I returned to the crossword puzzle I'd been working on. No urgency, no fear, just a note. The rest of the shift passed in the usual silence. The building's climate control system hummed its constant background drone. Somewhere in the mechanical room, a fan bearing made its familiar rhythmic squeak through the reinforced windows. I could see nothing but darkness and the distant glow of Henderson on the horizon. I went home at 8, slept through the afternoon, and returned that night expecting more of the same. For the next week, the feeds remained unremarkable. I settled back into the rhythm of the work. Arrive, check the previous shift's logs, monitor the screens, fill the empty hours with podcasts and reading. The facility employed 6 overnight monitors across different shifts. We rarely saw each other, communicating mainly through handwritten notes and the digital shift logs. On the following Wednesday, 10 days after the initial spike, it happened again. 0241. Station Delta 7. Same frequency range, same smooth onset and decline, same approximate 3-minute duration. I leaned closer to my monitor, pulling up the detailed spectrographic analysis. The signature was nearly identical to the first occurrence. Not exactly the same. There were minor variations in amplitude, but the overall shape of the event matched with unusual precision. Natural interference doesn't repeat like that. Weather patterns, solar activity, atmospheric conditions, they create similar effects, but never with this kind of consistency. Each occurrence of natural phenomena has its own character, its own irregularities. This looked more like a recording being played twice. I pulled up the archived data from the first spike and placed the two events side by side. The correlation was remarkable. Whoever reviewed this data later might dismiss it as the same type of interference recurring under similar conditions. But the similarity troubled me. I expanded my search, pulling data from the surrounding stations. Delta 5 and Delta 9, the nearest installations to Delta 7, showed nothing unusual during either event. Whatever generated the signal was localized, affecting only one monitoring point. For the first time, I felt a whisper of unease. I updated my log. 0241 Delta 7 EM spike, similar to event from 10 days prior. Signature correlation approximately 95%. Recommend equipment diagnostic. The night continued. The screens scrolled their endless data. The building maintained its mechanical breathing. But I kept glancing back at those two waveforms, wondering what I was actually seeing. Chapter 2. The Return. Over the following month, the signal appeared 6 more times, always at Station Delta 7, always in the early morning hours, between 2 and 3, always with that same smooth onset, 3-minute duration and clean decline. Each appearance showed minor variations, amplitude fluctuations, slight frequency drift, but the fundamental signature remained consistent. More importantly, the variations themselves seemed purposeful. The signal wasn't degrading or strengthening. It was adjusting. I began documenting each occurrence with increased detail, noting not just the basic parameters, but also the subtle differences between events. The frequency would shift slightly higher or lower. The amplitude would pulse in different patterns. The timing between appearances gradually shortened from 10 days to 8, then to 6. The signal was learning, or testing, or both. I submitted equipment diagnostic requests after the third occurrence. The response came back clean, all systems functioning within normal parameters. I submitted a formal report after the fifth occurrence, detailing the pattern and requesting analysis. The report was acknowledged, filed, and never mentioned again. The system was designed to handle anomalies that broke clear thresholds. This signal was too subtle, too brief, too technically unremarkable to trigger the bureaucratic machinery that might investigate it seriously. On November 12th, during the 8th occurrence, I tried something different. When the signal appeared at 0233, I immediately activated the high-resolution recording mode for Delta 7, capturing data at 10 times the normal sampling rate. The system usually reserved this mode for confirmed events: meteor strikes, seismic activity, weapons tests. Using it for an unverified anomaly violated protocol. But I needed better data. The signal responded. Within 30 seconds of activating high-resolution mode, the frequency shifted. Not dramatically, just a subtle slide upward in the spectrum, as if the source had detected the increased scrutiny and adjusted its output accordingly. I sat frozen, watching the real-time spectrograph. This wasn't atmospheric interference. This wasn't equipment malfunction. This was reactive behavior. The signal held its new frequency for 90 seconds, then dropped back to baseline exactly as before. Total duration: 3 minutes, same as always. I deactivated the high-resolution mode and sat in the humming silence of the monitoring room, trying to construct a rational explanation for what I'd just witnessed. Equipment could malfunction in reactive ways: feedback loops, calibration errors, electromagnetic interference from the monitoring systems themselves. But none of those explanations felt adequate. The signal knew it was being watched more closely, and it had changed in response. I typed up a detailed incident report, describing the reactive frequency shift and recommending immediate investigation. I marked it priority, submitted it through official channels, and waited. 3 days later, I received a response. Report reviewed. Event classified as equipment interaction. No further action required. They weren't going to investigate. They weren't going to send anyone. The signal would remain my problem, my mystery, my slowly building obsession. Chapter 3. The Pattern. December brought cold nights and crystalline skies over the Nevada desert. The signal continued its pattern, appearing every 5 to 6 days now, always during my shift, always at Station Delta 7. I began, arriving early, reviewing the previous shift's data for any sign of the signal appearing when I wasn't present. Nothing. Either it only occurred during my overnight hours, or the other monitors weren't noticing it. Given how subtle the signature was, the latter seemed more likely, but I started to suspect the former. The signal avoided peak operational hours. During the day, when management was present and multiple systems ran active monitoring protocols, it never appeared. It emerged during the transitions, the quiet hours when automation ruled and human oversight was minimal. It knew when it could go unnoticed. I began mapping its behavior more carefully, creating spreadsheets that tracked every parameter I could measure: frequency range, amplitude, duration, time of occurrence, atmospheric conditions, solar activity, seismic background. I was looking for the trigger, the external factor that might explain the pattern. Instead, I found something else. The signal appeared to time itself around system maintenance cycles. Every monitoring station ran automated diagnostic routines at scheduled intervals. Calibration checks, sensor resets, data buffer dumps. These routines created brief windows when the systems were technically active, but not fully attentive, processing their own maintenance rather than watching for anomalies. The signal appeared during these windows. Not every time, that would be too obvious, but often enough that the correlation couldn't be coincidence. It was exploiting gaps in our attention, moments when the automated systems were looking inward rather than outward. This required knowledge of our operations. On December 19th, I decided to break protocol more seriously. I'd been documenting the signal for nearly 3 months. I had data, patterns, analysis, but I had no one to share it with who would take it seriously. During my lunch break, a lonely hour spent in the facility's break room at 4 a.m, I drafted an email to the National Radio Astronomy Observatory. I described the signal in technical terms, omitted any mention of its reactive behaviour, and framed it as a potential astronomical phenomenon that our equipment had detected. I sent it from my personal email address, carefully separating it from my official capacity. The response came 2 days later. Thank you for your interest, but without precise coordinates and continuous monitoring data, they couldn't prioritize investigation. They received hundreds of similar reports annually. Most were interference, equipment errors, or misidentified natural phenomena. I was on my own. The signal appeared again on December 22nd at 0251. This time, I tried something new. Instead of just recording, I transmitted. Using the facility's emergency broadcast system, normally reserved for alerting remote field stations about dangerous conditions, I sent a simple, repeating tone on the same frequency band the signal occupied. 3 short pulses, a pause, 3 more pulses, the universal pattern of intelligent communication. The response was immediate and unsettling. The signal stopped. For exactly 60 seconds, the electromagnetic spectrum went completely silent. Not just the anomalous signal, everything in that frequency range disappeared, as if something had muted the entire channel. Then the signal returned, but altered. The frequency had shifted dramatically, moving to a band 3 MHz higher. The amplitude had doubled, and the waveform had changed from a smooth curve to a complex, modulated pattern. It was no longer hiding, it was demonstrating. The new signal lasted 90 seconds, then vanished completely. The frequency band returned to its normal background noise. I sat motionless, my heart hammering in my chest, understanding with absolute certainty that I had just made contact with something intelligent, something that had been carefully calibrating its presence to remain beneath notice, something that, when directly addressed, could no longer pretend to be interference. I didn't file a report about the broadcast. I couldn't. Using the emergency system for an experiment violated multiple regulations, but I documented everything in my personal notes, time-stamping each observation, preserving the data. The signal didn't appear for the next 11 days. I spent those nights in tense anticipation, watching the feeds with unusual intensity. Had I scared it off? Had I triggered some kind of response that would bring official attention? Had I imagined the entire interaction? On January 2nd, at 0317, it returned. Different frequency, different pattern, but unmistakably the same intelligence behind it. And this time, I wasn't the only one watching. Chapter 4. Independent Confirmation. Jackson Torres had worked at the facility for 7 years, longer than anyone else on the overnight rotation. He was a quiet man in his 50s, former Air Force communications specialist, the kind of person who preferred silence to small talk. We'd crossed paths maybe a dozen times during shift changes, exchanged maybe 24 words total. On January 4th, during the overlap between the evening and overnight shifts, I found him waiting in the parking lot by my car. The desert night was cold enough to show his breath as he approached. "Got a minute?" he asked. We walked to the edge of the parking lot, away from the building's exterior cameras. "You've been seeing it too," he said. Not a question. I felt my pulse quicken. Seeing what? Delta 7, the signal. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket. "I saw your logs, the equipment diagnostics you requested, the high-resolution captures." I said nothing, waiting. "I saw the same thing 6 weeks ago," Jackson continued. "Different frequency, same pattern. Thought I was going crazy or the equipment was dying." He unfolded the paper, a printout of spectrographic data. Then it happened again, and again, always during my shift, always when I was alone. The data on his printout showed the same signature I'd been tracking, but from late October, before I'd started documenting it seriously. "You didn't report it," I said. "I did. First 2 times. Jackson's expression was carefully neutral. "Got the same response you did. Equipment interaction. No action required. So I stopped reporting. We stood in the cold, our breath forming clouds, both understanding what we weren't saying aloud. Whatever this was, it was real. It was persistent, and the official response was to ignore it. "When did yours start?" Jackson asked. "Late September. Delta 7, same as yours." "Always during your shift," I nodded. Jackson was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "I think it's learning our schedules, the monitoring patterns. Who's paying attention? Or it's learning how to be seen only by specific people," I said. "People who won't escalate effectively." The implication settled between us. Either we were both experiencing the same equipment malfunction, unlikely given the differences in timing and frequency, or something was deliberately calibrating its presence to remain beneath official notice while still being detected by individual monitors. "Have you tried interacting with it?" Jackson asked carefully. I hesitated, then nodded. "Once. Emergency broadcast, simple pulse pattern. It responded by changing its signature completely." Jackson's expression shifted, not surprise, but confirmation. "I thought about trying that. Decided it was better not to provoke something I didn't understand. Probably smarter than what I did. Maybe," Jackson refolded his printout. "But now we know it responds, that it's not just passive interference. What do you think it is?" He was quiet for several seconds. "I spent 15 years in Air Force communications, monitored everything from Soviet satellite transmissions to atmospheric research balloons. I've seen every kind of natural and artificial interference you can imagine." He met my eyes. "This is different. The way it adapts, the way it times itself, the way it responds to observation. That's not natural. And it's not any human technology I've ever encountered." "Then what?" Jackson's expression was carefully controlled. "I don't know. But whatever it is, it doesn't want to be noticed officially. And maybe we should respect that. Or maybe we should figure out what it wants." "You're assuming it wants something from us," Jackson said. "But what if we're just part of what it's observing? What if contact isn't the point?" I didn't have an answer for that. We returned to the building separately. Jackson's shift was ending. Mine was beginning. As I settled into the monitoring station, I pulled up the Delta 7 feeds and waited. The signal appeared at 0342. Same frequency range as before. Same smooth pattern. But now I knew I wasn't alone in seeing it, and somehow that made it more unsettling rather than less. Chapter 5. Decoding the Noise. For the next 3 weeks, Jackson and I met irregularly during shift changes, comparing notes and sharing data. He brought 7 years of observations, intermittent at first, becoming more consistent over the past 6 months. I contributed my detailed documentation and the results of my broadcast experiment. Together, we began to see the larger pattern. The signal wasn't random in its appearances. It followed a progression, each occurrence building on the previous one. Early detections were simple, single frequency spikes that could easily be dismissed as interference. Over time, they grew more complex. Multi-frequency patterns, modulated waveforms, structured pulses. It was teaching us to recognize it, or teaching itself to communicate in ways we might understand. I began attempting basic analysis during my shifts, running the signal through pattern recognition software designed for SETI research. The results were frustrating. The signal wasn't language, at least not language as we understood it. It wasn't mathematical sequences. It wasn't any of the hypothetical formats scientists had imagined for extraterrestrial communication. But it wasn't random either. The structure was too consistent, too deliberately crafted. Each appearance contained internal patterns, repeating elements, hierarchical organization, recursive structures. It resembled data compression or executable code more than a message. On January 28th, I made a discovery that changed everything. I'd been running correlation analysis between the signal's appearance and various environmental factors, still looking for the external trigger. Instead, I found something internal. The signal responded to observation. Not metaphorically, literally. When I actively monitored the Delta 7 feeds, watching the real-time displays, the signal would appear within 30 minutes approximately 70% of the time. When I left the monitoring station to take breaks or handle other tasks, appearances dropped to near zero. I tested this systematically over 5 shifts, carefully documenting my attention patterns. The correlation held. The signal appeared more frequently when I was actively watching. It knew when it was being observed, and it preferred being observed. This realization was deeply unsettling. It suggested the signal wasn't broadcasting indiscriminately, waiting for any receiver. It was targeting specific moments of attention, emerging only when it could be perceived. I shared this finding with Jackson during our next meeting. He'd noticed something similar, but hadn't quantified it. "It's like quantum mechanics," he said. "The act of observation affects the observed." "Or it's aware of us individually," I replied, responding to our attention as a form of interaction. Either way, it implies intelligence, awareness. We were both quiet, considering the implications. "Have you noticed the physical effects?" Jackson asked finally. I looked at him sharply. "What physical effects?" "After strong appearances when the signal peaks." He seemed reluctant to continue. "Equipment behaves strangely. Nothing that triggers alarms, but small things. Clocks drift, sound feels different, like the environment itself is slightly off." I'd noticed the clock issue. Had reset my watch twice in the past month, but I'd attributed it to battery problems. "How much drift?" I asked. "Seconds, maybe a minute at most, but consistent, always running slow after a strong signal." "Localized time dilation?" Jackson shrugged. "Or something affecting our perception of time, or equipment malfunction. Take your pick." Over the next week, I paid careful attention to these secondary effects. Jackson was right. After particularly strong signal appearances, subtle changes rippled through the facility. Digital clocks would be off by 30 to 60 seconds. Audio sounded slightly muted, as if the air itself had become denser. Distances seemed subtly wrong. The walk from the monitoring room to the break room felt longer, though measuring it showed no actual difference. Everything remained technically functional. No alarms triggered, no systems failed, but the world felt subtly wrong. On February 7th at 0324, the strongest signal yet appeared. The amplitude was triple anything I'd recorded before. The frequency range expanded, spanning nearly 10 megahertz. The pattern was extraordinarily complex, layered waveforms that suggested multiple, simultaneous transmissions, and then I experienced the encounter. Chapter 6. The Missed Alert. The signal lasted 7 minutes that night, more than twice its usual duration. I recorded everything, watching the spectrograph display patterns of stunning complexity. Whatever was transmitting was demonstrating capability, showing us the full range of what it could do. When it ended, I immediately began compiling a comprehensive report, 3 months of data, pattern analysis, Jackson's corroborating observations, the reactive behavior, the physical effects, everything. I submitted it through official channels at 0513, marked urgent, requesting immediate analysis and possible escalation to, I wasn't even sure who, whatever authority handled unexplained electromagnetic phenomena. The automated acknowledgement came back within seconds. Report received. Case number assigned. Analysis pending. I waited through the rest of my shift, expecting a call, an email, some kind of human response to what I'd documented. Nothing came. I returned the next night to find my report had been processed. The case was marked resolved with a brief note. Analysis completed. Phenomenon consistent with ionospheric reflection of distant commercial radio transmissions. No anomalous activity detected. Case closed. They'd looked at 3 months of careful documentation and dismissed it in less than 24 hours. I pulled up the analysis report. It was clearly automated, a template filled with generic explanations. No human had actually examined the data. The system had scanned for keywords, matched against known phenomena, and auto-generated a closure. The bureaucracy was designed to process genuine anomalies, but only if they exceeded certain clear thresholds. What I documented was too subtle, too strange, too far outside normal categories. The system literally couldn't process it, so it defaulted to the closest match and closed the case. I sat staring at the screen, understanding with absolute clarity. The system was designed to dismiss anomalies that did not break explicit rules. The signal was exploiting this intentionally. It remained beneath alarm thresholds, avoided triggering automatic alerts, manifested in ways that appeared technically possible through natural phenomena. It was calibrated perfectly to be detectable, but not officially significant. I felt a wave of frustration, followed by a strange kind of respect. Whatever intelligence was behind this signal, it understood our systems better than we did. It had studied our bureaucratic blind spots and positioned itself precisely within them. That night, the signal appeared again. Watching it, I felt different than before. This wasn't an unknown phenomenon I was documenting. This was a deliberate communication from something that had learned our language, not our words, but our attention patterns, our protocols, our institutional limitations. It had studied us thoroughly, and now it was ready for the next phase. Chapter 7. The Physical Effect. The first unmistakable physical effect occurred on February 14th. The signal appeared at 0258, strong and complex as it had been a week earlier. I was monitoring as usual, documenting the waveforms, when I noticed something wrong with the clock on my computer display. The seconds were counting normally, but they felt slow. Each tick seemed to take longer than it should. I checked my watch, an old mechanical timepiece my father had given me, and compared it to the computer. They were synchronized, both counting seconds at the same rate. But subjectively, time felt stretched. I stood up from my desk, intending to walk to the break room, and found the distance had changed. Not physically. When I measured it later, the corridor was exactly 47 feet, as it had always been. But walking, it felt like crossing twice that distance. My footsteps echoed strangely, as if the walls were farther apart than they appeared. The fluorescent lights buzzed at their normal frequency, but the sound was muted, dampened by air that seemed thicker than it should be. I returned to my desk and checked the signal. Still transmitting, still complex and strong. Then I noticed something else. Shadows were falling wrong. The overhead lights cast shadows directly downward, as they always had, but the shadows themselves seemed deeper, darker, as if the light wasn't penetrating quite as far as it should. I held my hand under the desk lamp and watched my shadow on the wall. It was there, properly positioned, but somehow more substantial than normal. The signal peaked at 0312, then began its usual decline. As the amplitude dropped, the physical effects normalized. Time regained its normal pace. Distances felt correct again. Shadows returned to their usual translucency. By 0320, everything was back to normal. Everything except my certainty that I'd just experienced something impossible. I documented it all, knowing even as I typed that it would sound like fatigue-induced hallucination or equipment-induced psychological effects. How do you prove that time felt wrong, that space felt compressed, that shadows were too dark? Jackson confirmed similar experiences during our next meeting. It's like reality gets thicker, he said. The air, the space, even thought feels slower, but only during the strong signals. Any idea what could cause that? He shook his head. Nothing natural. Gravity can affect time, but we'd need a massive object nearby. Electromagnetic fields can affect perception, but not like this. This feels more fundamental. Over the following weeks, these effects became more pronounced during signal events. Equipment would function normally, all readings within parameters, but the subjective experience of the monitoring room would change. Sound would muffle, light would dim without actually becoming darker. Temperature would feel wrong without the thermometer changing. And always, time would stretch. I began keeping 2 clocks during my shifts, my mechanical watch and my phone. After strong signal events, they would diverge by 30 to 90 seconds. My phone, connected to network time servers, running slow compared to my mechanical timepiece. Something was affecting digital timekeeping specifically, or affecting the fundamental relationship between electromagnetic systems and time itself. On March 3rd, during a particularly intense signal event, I experienced something new. Chapter 8. The encounter without seeing. The signal began normally at 0307. Strong amplitude, complex patterns, exactly as I'd come to expect. I was documenting as usual when the physical effects started. Time stretched, space compressed, and then something else happened. My perception lagged. I would think about reaching for my coffee cup, and a moment later realise I'd already done it. I would turn to look at a monitor and find myself already facing it, with no memory of the motion between. Thought and action were becoming disconnected, as if the signal that normally travelled from intention to execution was being delayed or rerouted. I stood up, trying to ground myself in physical reality, and felt the room shift, not physically. The walls remained where they were, the equipment in place, the lights burning steadily overhead, but space itself felt compressed, folded in ways that 3 dimensions couldn't properly contain. I walked toward the break room and found myself there without experiencing the journey. One moment I was at my desk, the next I was standing by the coffee maker, with no sensation of the steps between. Panic started rising in my chest. This was beyond perception effects. This was reality itself becoming unreliable. I turned to head back to my desk and stopped. There was something in the monitoring room, not visible, not audible, not detectable by any sense I could name, but it was there with absolute certainty. Presence, pure, undeniable presence. I stood frozen in the doorway, every instinct screaming that I was not alone. The monitoring room, familiar after 3 years of overnight shifts, felt occupied by something vast, something that existed in more dimensions than I could perceive, pressing against the limited 3-dimensional space we called reality. It wasn't threatening, it wasn't communicating, it was simply there, observing, processing, existing in a way that my brain struggled to categorize. I don't know how long I stood there. Time had become meaningless. Could have been seconds, could have been minutes. Then it was gone. The presence lifted as smoothly as it had arrived. Space resumed its normal dimensions. Time reacquired its familiar flow. I found myself back at my desk, with no clear memory of returning, my hands on the keyboard, the monitoring screens showing normal background levels. The signal had ended. I checked my watch against my phone. Divergence, 2 minutes and 37 seconds. I checked the timestamp on my last log entry, 0309. My mechanical watch read 0321. I had lost 12 minutes, or experienced 12 minutes in a compressed time frame, or something else entirely that human language lacked words to describe. I sat shaking, understanding with perfect clarity that I'd just experienced an encounter, not communication, not contact in any conventional sense, simply the proximity of something so fundamentally different from human consciousness that our overlap created distortions in the basic fabric of perceived reality. There was no visible entity, no communication, just the certainty of presence. And now it was gone, leaving me alone in the humming silence of the monitoring room, trying to reconcile what I'd experienced with any framework of understanding I possessed. I didn't log this encounter officially. I couldn't. How do you file a report about experiencing something that left no physical evidence beyond a divergence in timekeeping? But I documented everything in my personal notes, preserving every detail while the memory was fresh, and I waited to see if it would happen again. Chapter 9. The Global Echo. It didn't happen again. Not to me. The signal continued appearing during my shifts, but the intense physical effects from March 3rd never occurred. The presence I'd felt never returned. Whatever had manifested that night had completed its observation and moved on. But Jackson reported a similar experience 2 weeks later. Then a week after that, a monitor from a different facility entirely. In late March, I began searching online for reports of similar phenomena. I was careful, using generic search terms, looking for patterns rather than specific events. What I found was concerning. Over the past 6 months, at least 17 different monitoring stations across the southwest had documented unexplained electromagnetic anomalies. Different facilities, different agencies, different monitoring purposes, seismological research, atmospheric studies, communications arrays, defense installations. Same pattern, same timing, same careful calibration to remain beneath official notice. None of the reports were publicly acknowledged. None triggered formal investigations. Each was logged, categorized as equipment interference or natural phenomena, and quietly filed away. But the timing told a story. The anomalies had begun appearing at different facilities in a spreading pattern, originating from somewhere in central Nevada and radiating outward over the course of a year. Each facility experienced the progression I documented. Simple signals at first, growing more complex, eventually producing the physical effects and presence experiences. Something was methodically visiting monitoring stations across the region, interacting with them one by one, learning from each encounter before moving to the next. We weren't the target of contact. We were part of a much larger survey. On April 9th, Jackson found me in the parking lot again, his expression grim. "They're shutting down Delta 7, he said, without preamble. I felt my stomach drop. What? Scheduled for decommission in 2 weeks, budget reallocation. The official reason is redundancy. Delta 5 and Delta 9 supposedly provide sufficient coverage. He handed me a printout of the official notice, but the timing is interesting. I scanned the document. Standard bureaucratic language, nothing suggesting the real reason. They know, I said quietly. Maybe. Or maybe Delta 7 has served its purpose. The signal hasn't appeared there in 11 days. He was right. I'd noticed the absence but had attributed it to random variation in the pattern. It's moved on, Jackson continued. Whatever it was studying at Delta 7, it's finished. And now they're closing the station. To hide the evidence? Or because there's nothing left to monitor? Jackson's expression was carefully neutral. I've been tracking the pattern across facilities. Every station that's experienced sustained contact goes offline within 6 months. sometimes decommissioned, sometimes relocated, sometimes just quietly shut down with minimal explanation. Someone knows what's happening. Someone knows something is happening, Jackson corrected. But I don't think they understand it any better than we do. The response is institutional. Close potential security risks, eliminate anomalies from the data stream, maintain plausible deniability. I looked out across the desert, watching heat shimmer rise from the dark earth under the moonlight. So what do? We keep watching, Jackson said. The signal will appear somewhere else, another facility, another monitor working overnight, wondering if they're seeing things. And we let them go through it alone. Let them think they're crazy. Jackson was quiet for a long moment. I don't know what else we can do. This thing, whatever it is, doesn't want direct contact. It's not here to communicate. It's here to observe, to map, to study. We're part of the environment it's cataloguing. Then what was the point of the encounter? The presence? Maybe checking if we could perceive it, testing the limits of human awareness. Jackson met my eyes. Maybe just confirming we're not what it's looking for. The thought settled like ice in my stomach. All of this, the careful signals, the reactive behaviour, the physical manifestations, wasn't about contacting us. It was about working around us while studying something else entirely. Humans were the background noise, not the signal. Chapter 10. The Theory. My last shift at the Tonopah facility was on April 28th. The next day I was transferring to a different position, daytime work, better hours, fewer questions about what I did alone all night. I spent that final overnight shift reviewing everything I documented over the past 7 months. Hundreds of signal events, detailed analyses, Jackson's corroborating data, reports from other facilities, the progression from simple electromagnetic anomalies to reality-bending encounters. And I formed a restrained hypothesis. The intelligence behind the signal wasn't exploring. It wasn't invading. It wasn't attempting contact in any conventional sense. It was mapping reactions. Every appearance of the signal was a probe, testing how our monitoring systems responded, how human attention worked, how the fabric of local space-time could be manipulated without triggering catastrophic effects or official alarm. We were part of the environment it was cataloguing, no different from the electromagnetic spectrum, the geological substrate, the atmospheric composition. Interesting, perhaps, worth studying, but not the focus. The focus was Earth itself, or something about Earth's properties that we couldn't perceive. The signals weren't messages, they were tools, instruments being calibrated to measure or manipulate something beyond our awareness. The physical effects, time dilation, spatial compression, the sensation of presence were side effects of the measurement process. Like ripples from a stone dropped in water, affecting the surface while probing the depths. And the most unsettling realization, observation itself might be the only interaction we were capable of. Whatever this intelligence was, it existed or operated in dimensions we couldn't directly perceive. The signals were its interface with our limited three-dimensional reality, the absolute minimum presence required to accomplish its actual purpose. We weren't ignored because we were irrelevant. We were bypassed because we were insufficient. The signal had learned everything it needed to know about human perception, about our monitoring systems, about the bureaucratic structures that governed our institutions. It had catalogued our attention patterns, our limitations, our blind spots. And now it could work undetected, conducting whatever survey or study or operation it had actually come here to perform. The encounters would continue, I was certain of that. Other facilities, other monitors, other people working overnight shifts would see the signals and wonder if they were going crazy. Some would report it, most reports would be dismissed. A few might escalate, only to be quietly resolved with plausible explanations. And somewhere beyond our perception, beyond our instruments, beyond our capacity to interfere or even fully recognize, the actual work would continue. I submitted my final shift log at 07:45. All systems normal, no anomalies detected. It was technically true. The signal hadn't appeared that night. Or maybe it had, just in a way I could no longer recognize. Epilogue. Still listening. I left the Tonopah facility on a bright April morning, driving east toward Henderson with the desert spreading endlessly in all directions. In my rear-view mirror, the monitoring station shrank to insignificance, just another anonymous building in a landscape full of secrets. Jackson stayed on. He's still there now, as far as I know, working the overnight shifts, watching the feeds. We email occasionally, carefully worded messages about nothing in particular, but I know he's still listening, still watching for the signal. The last time we spoke, he mentioned that Delta 7 had been decommissioned on schedule, the equipment removed, the station closed, all records archived. Officially, it never experienced anything unusual beyond routine atmospheric interference, but Delta 9 started showing anomalies 2 weeks later. Same pattern, different frequency, learning, adapting, continuing the survey. I sometimes wonder what they were found, what aspect of Earth or reality or dimensional space they were mapping with such methodical precision. What purpose drove them to manifest in our electromagnetic spectrum, to press briefly against the boundaries of our perception, to catalogue our responses before moving on. I wonder if they're still here, still studying, still observing, still operating in the spaces between our attention and our awareness. Or maybe they finished their survey, collected their data, moved on to the next world, the next civilization, the next set of environmental parameters that required mapping. Maybe Earth is just one entry in a vast catalogue of worlds, marked and measured and understood in ways we could never recognize. I work daytime hours now, regular schedule, no more overnight monitoring, no more watching waveforms drift across screens while the desert night presses against reinforced windows. But sometimes, late at night when sleep won't come, I pull up the archived data on my personal computer. I review the patterns, the progressions, the careful escalation from invisible to undeniable, and back to invisible again. And I think about what Jackson said during our last meeting in the parking lot. If something can learn how not to be seen, how long has it already been here? The signal hasn't returned to any of the facilities I can track. Or maybe it has. Maybe it's learned how to exist in our world without creating ripples in our instruments. Maybe it's completed its calibration and now operates perfectly within our blindness, conducting its survey in a register we cannot detect, studying whatever it came here to study with impunity. Maybe observation itself was never the interaction. Maybe the interaction was what happened after we stopped being able to observe. I still keep 2 clocks, my mechanical watch and my phone. I check them against each other regularly, looking for divergence, for that telltale drift that would indicate something nearby affecting digital timekeeping. They've remained synchronized, but I wonder sometimes if that means the signal is gone, or if it just means I'm no longer sensitive enough to detect its influence. If, having mapped my perceptual limits during those months in Tonopah, it now knows exactly how to manifest without disturbing them. The night shift goes on at facilities across the southwest. Different monitors watch different screens, logging routine anomalies, filing standard reports. Most see nothing unusual, but somewhere tonight, someone is noticing a signal slightly out of expected range, not strong enough to trigger alarms, appearing once then disappearing. They're logging it as interference, no urgency, no fear, just a note. And the presence in the dark continues its patient work, invisible and undisturbed, mapping reactions and cataloguing responses while we document the shadows of its passing and convince ourselves we've seen nothing remarkable. The signal that wasn't meant for us was never meant to be undetectable. It was meant to teach us the limits of our detection. And now, having learned our boundaries, it operates freely within them. Still here, still listening, still beyond our capacity to truly perceive what it's studying, or why, or what it will do with the information once the survey is complete. I turn off my computer and check my clocks one more time. Still synchronized, which means either nothing is happening or everything is happening, and I just can't see it anymore.